She was 19 years old, standing at the bottom of a canyon that smelled like sage, sun-baked stone copper dust. The sun had just crested the eastern rim, throwing a blade of gold across the wreckage of a freight wagon half buried in sand. Its back axle was snapped clean. Its tongue hung at an angle that suggested violence rather than neglect. Canvas shreds clung to the ribs of its bonnet frame, fluttering in the morning breeze like the last flags of a surrendered army. The man beside her, a weather-cracked rancher who held the salvage deed in his tobacco-stained fingers, watched her with the expression people reserve for stray dogs chasing their own tails. He shifted his weight from one boot to the other, waiting for her to come to her senses. She did not come to her senses. She reached into the pocket of her worn canvas coat, pulled out a $10 bill that represented exactly half of everything she owned on this earth, held it out between two fingers calloused beyond their years. Her voice carried no hesitation, no tremor, nothing that might invite negotiation or pity. "I'll buy it." The rancher took the money. He did not wish her luck. To understand how Alara Wren arrived at the bottom of Red Creek Canyon with $10, a blacksmith's hammer, a canvas sack of provisions, you would need to travel backward through 19 years of loss, silence, observation. You would need to start in Missouri. She was born in the spring of 1863 in a clapboard house near the Gasconade River, a place she would never see again after the age of 5. Her memories of Missouri were not memories in any reliable sense. They were sensory fragments disconnected from narrative. The green of cottonwood leaves against a white sky, the particular weight of humid air before a thunderstorm, the smell of wet black soil that clung to everything, to clothes, to skin, to the underside of fingernails. She remembered her mother's hands, but not her mother's face. She remembered the sound of her father's voice, a low, careful baritone, but not a single word he ever spoke. These fragments were all that remained of the people who had made her preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of a book she could no longer read. In the summer of 1868, her parents joined a wagon train bound for the Utah Territory. The journey was supposed to take 4 months. They died of cholera in the 7th week somewhere on the high plains of Nebraska, buried in shallow graves marked with stones that the wind would scatter before winter. Alara survived because children sometimes do, because the organism is stubborn before the mind learns to give up. A family in the train kept her fed, kept her breathing, carried her forward into the territory her parents had died trying to reach. She was delivered to Providence like a parcel with no return address. A distant cousin of her mother's, a man named Horace Pemberton, accepted custody with the enthusiasm of someone inheriting a debt. His house was narrow, dark, perpetually cold. His wife was a silent woman who moved through rooms like smoke present, but never quite there. They had 4 children of their own, all boys, all older than Alara, all possessed of the casual cruelty that children practice when they sense a hierarchy beneath them. For 10 years, Alara occupied the lowest rung. She slept on a straw pallet in the pantry. She rose before dawn to haul water, feed chickens, scrub floors, empty chamber pots. She ate last war hand-me-downs from the oldest Pemberton boy that hung on her thin frame like grain sacks. She was not beaten. Horace Pemberton was not a violent man, but she was erased. She was made to understand through 1,000 small daily exclusions that she existed in this house on sufferance, that the roof over her head was a gift she could never repay. That gratitude was her only currency. She learned in those years to become invisible. She learned to read the moods of the household, the way a sailor reads weather, the tightening of Horace's jaw that meant he'd lost money at the mercantile, the particular silence of Mrs. Pemberton that preceded one of her headaches, the restless energy of the boys that would seek a target if not redirected. She learned that powerful people telegraph their intentions long before they act in the set of their shoulders, the rhythm of their breathing, the things they choose not to say. It was an education in survival paid for in loneliness. Her only escape was at the blacksmith shop at the end of the main street, 300 yards from the Pemberton house, but a world away from its suffocating smallness. The shop belonged to Gideon Marsh, a widower in his late 50s, whose wife had died of scarlet fever a decade earlier, leaving him alone with his forge, his iron, his silence. He was a large man, not tall but broad, with forearms like fence posts wrapped in leather. His hands were landscapes of old burns, soot-filled creases, calluses layered over calluses. His beard was iron gray, perpetually singed at the edges. His eyes set deep beneath heavy brows were the pale blue of creek water in winter, clear, calm, startlingly kind. Alara first appeared at the open door of his shop when she was 9 years old. She stood in the threshold, backlit by afternoon sun, watching him draw out a rod of glowing steel on the anvil face. She did not speak. She did not enter. She simply watched with an intensity of focus that Gideon recognized because he had seen it before in his own reflection decades ago when he was a boy standing at the door of his father's forge in Pennsylvania. He let her watch. The next day she came back. The day after that. By the end of the first week, he gestured her inside with a tilt of his head. By the end of the month, he had her working the bellows, a task that required rhythm endurance, attention to the color of the coals. She was good at it. She was good at everything he showed her. Not because she was gifted, though she was, but because she brought to each task the ferocious concentration of someone who has found the one place in the world where she is not unwanted. Over the next 6 years, Gideon taught her the full scope of his craft. He started with the fundamentals, the names of tools, the properties of different metals, the relationship between heat-time force. He taught her to bank coals so they held their temperature through the night. He taught her to judge the heat of steel by its color black, to blood red, to cherry, to orange, to yellow, to white. Each shade a language spoken by the metal about its willingness to be shaped. She learned to swing a hammer with her whole body, not just her arm power rising from the planted feet, through the hips, channeling through the shoulder into the wrist. The hammer an extension of intention rather than a blunt instrument. Then came the finer arts, drawing out steel, tapering it, upsetting it to thicken a section. The science of quenching, plunging hot metal into water or oil at precisely the right moment, too soon, producing brittleness, too late, producing softness. The mystery of tempering, reheating quenched steel to a specific color straw, bronze, purple, blue, each shade unlocking a different balance of hardness against flexibility. He taught her to listen to the ring of a hammer strike, to feel through her bones whether the steel beneath was cooperating or resisting. Every piece of metal has a memory, he told her one evening, holding up a piece of wrought iron he had folded 7 times. The firelight caught the layers visible in its cross-section, each fold a recorded history of heat, pressure, and tension. Every piece of wood has a grain. A person with patience can learn to read both. It was the closest Gideon Marsh ever came to philosophy, this quiet insistence that the physical world was legible to those who paid attention. He applied the principle to everything, to the selection of coal, to the fitting of a handle, to the assessment of a customer's honesty. He believed that truth was embedded in the material world, that lies could not survive contact with iron, that the forge was the most honest place on earth because fire does not negotiate. When Alara was 15, he gave her a hammer. He had forged it himself over the course of 3 weeks, working on it only in the early mornings before the shop opened, when the light was soft, when he could give it his full, unhurried attention. The head was small, barely 2 pounds, shaped for a hand smaller than his own. The face was perfectly flat, the peen slightly rounded the eye, precisely punched to accept a handle of seasoned hickory that he had turned on his lathe, sanding it until it fit her grip the way a key fits a lock. He balanced it by feel, holding it at the throat, letting it swing, adjusting the weight with file strokes so fine they were almost invisible. He presented it without ceremony. Set it on the workbench beside her, next to the piece she was working on, as casually as if it were a cup of coffee. She picked it up. She felt the balance, the way it sat in her hand, as if it had always been there waiting for her to arrive. She looked at him. He was already back at the anvil, his face turned away, but she could see the faint curve of a smile beneath his beard. It was the first thing anyone had ever made just for her. Not inherited, not handed down, not given out of obligation. Made. For her. With intention, with care, with the particular love that a craftsman pours into an object he knows will outlast him. She carried it with her from that day forward, tucked into her belt during the day, wrapped in oilcloth beside her pallet at night. It was proof. Proof that she had been seen. On a cold evening in November of 1881, Gideon sat by the forge, coughing into a rag that came away spotted with blood. He had been coughing for weeks, a deep, wet sound that seemed to come from somewhere below his lungs. He refused to see the doctor. He refused to slow down. The cough worsened through December, becoming a constant companion, a rattling counterpoint to the ring of his hammer. By January, he could no longer stand at the anvil for more than an hour without doubling over. Alara ran the shop. She took the orders, did the work, dealt with the customers. She heated broth on the forge, carried it to the small room behind the shop, where Gideon lay on his narrow bed, his breathing a labored whistle. She sat with him through the long nights, listening to the wind howl against the walls, feeding the fire, waiting. One night, near the end, the coughing stopped long enough for him to speak. His voice was a scraped whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the flames. He looked at her with those pale blue eyes, still clear, still kind, even as the rest of him was failing. Remember that everything has a second bottom, Alara. Metal, wood, people too. She did not understand what he meant. She filed it away in the place where she kept important things she could not yet interpret, trusting that its meaning would arrive when she needed it. Gideon Marsh died on a Tuesday morning in February of 1882. The temperature was 14 below zero. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a grave, so they stored his body in the ice house behind the church until the spring thaw. Ilara stood at the door of the shop, their shop, her shop, the only place in Providence that had ever felt like home, watching two men carry the pine box out into the blinding white glare of a winter sun. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford a display that invited either contempt or exploitation depending on who was watching. With Gideon gone, the last wall between Alara Wren, the quiet mechanisms of power in Providence crumbled. The town was governed in every meaningful sense by Deacon Josiah Caldwell. His title was religious, his authority civic, his methods commercial. He controlled the mercantile, the tithing office, the land registry, the sawmill. He sat on the town council. He delivered the Sunday sermon. He approved or denied building permits, water rights, grazing leases. He was a tall, thin man with a narrow face, a high forehead, hands that were always clean. He wore black wool suits regardless of the season, spoke in the measured cadences of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His piety was genuine in the way that a locked door is genuine. It served a purpose. It kept things in it, kept things out. Caldwell had watched the smithy for years. It sat on a prime lot at the intersection of Main Street, the road to the canyon, a strategic piece of real estate that would serve nicely as an expansion of his mercantile. While Gideon lived, the smithy was untouchable. The old man was respected, essential, connected to too many people, through too many years of honest work. But Gideon was dead. What remained was a 19-year-old girl with no family, no legal standing, no allies. Caldwell saw not a person but a problem to be solved, a piece to be removed from the board. He moved with the administrative precision of a man who understood that the most effective cruelties are the ones committed on paper. He did not come to the smithy himself. He sent his clerk. The clerk's name was Virgil Poole, a pale young man with ink-stained fingers, a receding chin, eyes that never quite met yours. He arrived at the smithy on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after Gideon's death. The forge was cold. Alara had not yet relit it that morning, still sorting through Gideon's accounts, trying to understand the financial architecture of the business she had inherited in everything but name. Virgil Poole stood in the doorway, the scent of cold iron swirling around him. He held a ledger sheet, a single page of figures written in Caldwell's elegant slanting hand. His voice was a hushed monotone, the voice of a man delivering someone else's verdict. The document was a tally of debts, he explained. Loans owed by the late Gideon Marsh to the town tithing office, to Caldwell's mercantile, to the sawmill. Tools purchased on credit. Supplies advanced against future work. Coal delivered but never paid for. Alara took the paper. She read it slowly, her eyes moving down the column of figures. The amounts were specific, detailed, convincing to anyone who did not know better. But Alara knew better. She had spent 6 years in this shop. She had watched Gideon pay for every sack of coal in cash, counted from the tin box he kept under the loose floorboard beneath the anvil. She had been present when he purchased his last set of tongs from a traveling supplier, handing over silver dollars one by one. She knew with the certainty of a witness that every figure on this page was a fabrication. At the bottom of the sheet below the impossible total was an offer written in the same elegant script. In exchange for forgiving this debt, the deed to the smithy, the adjoining lot, all tools, equipment, inventory contained therein would be transferred to the name of Deacon Josiah Caldwell. The occupant was given 24 hours to vacate the premises. Something moved inside Alara's chest. Not grief, she had used up her grief, but a cold, dense fury that settled behind her sternum like a swallowed stone. She looked at Virgil Poole. He was staring at the floor, his ink-stained fingers fidgeting with the hem of his coat. He was not a cruel man. He was a weak one, which in Providence amounted to the same thing. She tore the paper in half, then in quarters. The sound was loud in the quiet shop, sharp, final. Virgil Poole flinched as if she had struck him. She let the pieces fall to the floor between them. Her voice was low, steady, carrying an edge that surprised even her. Tell Deacon Caldwell that Gideon Marsh never owed a man a cent in his life, that these numbers are lies, that I will not sign away what belongs to me because a man in a black suit wrote fiction on a ledger page. Virgil Poole fled. He actually ran, his boots clattering on the frozen boardwalk outside, the sound fading into the winter silence. It was satisfying. It was also a mistake. By nightfall, the consequences arrived. Not Caldwell himself, he never dirtied his own hands, but two men Alara recognized as hands from the sawmill. Large, unhurried, carrying an authority that came from somewhere other than their own convictions. They stood at the smithy door, the same door Virgil Poole had occupied hours earlier, blocking the last of the daylight. The message was simple. The 24 hours had been a courtesy. The courtesy was withdrawn. She had until morning. If she was still on the premises when the sun came up, the matter would be handled differently. They did not specify what differently meant. They did not need to. Alara spent that night in the cold forge, working by lantern light, with the focused efficiency of someone dismantling a life. She had lost her chance to prepare properly. The torn paper, the defiant words had accelerated a timeline she might have managed. If she had kept her mouth shut, played the part of the frightened girl, bought herself days instead of hours. She knew this. She cataloged the error, filed it beside the fury that had produced it, recognized for the first time a dangerous pattern in herself. The impulse to strike back, to refuse submission, even when submission was the tactical choice. She cleaned the forge. She swept the floor. She oiled Gideon's tools, the rounding hammer, the flatters, the fullers, the dozen pairs of tongs he had shaped for every conceivable task, arranging each one on the rack where it belonged. She moved through these rituals with the tenderness of someone dressing a body for burial. In the morning, a man from the mercantile came to inventory the tools. He was thorough, clinical, his pencil scratching in a small notebook. His eyes lingered on the Peter Wright anvil that stood in the center of the shop, the heart of the place, a 200-pound monument of cast iron with a steel face that Gideon had maintained like a surgeon maintains a scalpel. The man offered $20 for the entire lot, tools that were worth 10 times that amount. Alara looked at the rack, at the hammer she had swung, the tongs she had gripped until her palms bled the anvil that had absorbed a decade of her labor. She took the money. There was no point in haggling with a man who held every card. She kept only what Caldwell's people would not miss: a small pry bar, a hand file, a length of rope, a belt axe. These she hid in her canvas sack beneath a change of clothes, a skillet flour, a tin of coffee, a block of matches. The hammer, Gideon's hammer, her hammer, she wrapped in oilcloth, placed at the bottom of the sack with the care of someone handling a relic. As she packed, her fingers brushed something cold beneath the loose floorboard by the workbench. Not the tin box which the mercantile man had already claimed, but something else. Gideon's personal ledger, a small leather-bound book she had never seen him write in, but which she recognized by the scorch mark on its cover. She opened it. Inside, in Gideon's blunt, practical handwriting, were years of meticulous records, every purchase, every payment, every transaction recorded with dates. Amounts, the names of suppliers. Coal from Hendricks paid cash, March 1879. Tongs from Pratt Supply, Salt Lake, paid cash, June 1880. Every line a direct contradiction of Caldwell's fabricated debts. She tucked the ledger inside her shirt against her skin. It was not enough to fight Caldwell in Providence. She had no standing, no advocate, no voice that would be heard above his, but it was evidence. Proof that the debts were invented. A weapon she could not yet wield, but refused to abandon. The sun set. Long shadows cut across the dirt street like the bars of a cell. Alara Wren walked out of the smithy, leaving the door unlocked behind her. She did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who had something to return to. She walked south past the last houses of Providence, past the church with its whitewashed steeple, past the mercantile where a lamp burned in Caldwell's upstairs office. She could see his silhouette behind the curtain, motionless, watching the street. She walked past the edge of town, where the orderly grid of lots, fences, property lines gave way to open sage flat, then broken country, then the long, sloping escarpment that fell away into the canyons. The transition was not just geographic, it was existential. With each step, the architecture of human authority, the surveyed lines, the deeds, the ledgers, the sermons receded, replaced by a landscape that operated on older, simpler principles. Gravity, erosion, the slow, patient work of water on stone. The air changed, losing the smell of wood smoke livestock. Human density, taking on the clean, sharp bite of sagebrush. Juniper sandstone still radiating the heat of the day. She moved with a steady, unhurried pace, her eyes on the ground reading the terrain as Gideon had taught her to read iron. The junipers on the north-facing slopes twisted into shapes that recorded decades of prevailing wind. The patterns of erosion in the cut banks layered sediment, telling stories of ancient floods. The faint track of a coyote that had crossed the trail that morning, its prints precise, purposeful, economical, an animal that wasted nothing. By late afternoon, she reached the floor of Red Creek Canyon. The walls rose on either side, sheer cliffs of crimson stone layered in horizontal bands. Ochre rust deep, vermilion-like pages in a book, written by a hand so vast it made human concerns seem trivial. The creek itself was a thin green line bordered by cottonwoods, whose leaves caught the slightest breeze, filling the canyon with a sound like distant scattered applause. She found the dugout a mile downstream. It was carved into the hard-packed earth of a cut bank barely taller than she was, its opening facing south toward the warmth. The roof was a lattice of juniper logs topped with soil that had sprouted a thin carpet of dry grass. A crude stone chimney leaned at the far end. It had been a line shack, once shelter for a stockman whose cattle grazed the canyon floor in some previous decade. Whoever he was long gone, leaving behind only this hollow in the earth, a few rusted tin cans, the faint ghosts of campfire smoke embedded in the stone. She swept it out. She gathered wood. She built a fire in the stone hearth, small, efficient, the kind of fire Gideon would have approved of, enough heat to cook, not enough to waste fuel. She fried dough in the skillet, boiled coffee in the tin, ate sitting in the doorway of the dugout, watching dusk fill the canyon like dark water rising in a well. The red rock deepened to purple, then to black. Stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky above the rim, sharp, cold, indifferent. The hammer lay across her knees. Its weight was familiar, grounding a physical connection to the one person who had considered her worth the effort of a gift. She was not despairing. Despair requires the belief that things should be different, that the world owes you something it has failed to deliver. Ilara had never believed the world owed her anything. What she felt was clarity, the stark, stripped-down awareness of a person who has lost everything except the ability to work. Tools can be taken, she said to the darkness, to the creek, to no one. Skill lives in the hands. She slept on the bare earth floor of the dugout, the fire dying to embers, the hammer beside her head. She woke before dawn, stiff, cold, hungry, alive. The morning light in Red Creek Canyon arrived in stages, first a pale glow along the eastern rim, then a slow flood of gold that crept down the cliff face, igniting each layer of stone in sequence, until the canyon floor was bathed in a warm, diffuse luminance that made the cottonwood leaves glow like coins. Ilara was already moving, exploring the canyon floor with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory. She cataloged resources. Water, the creek was low but steady, fed by springs somewhere upstream. Food, she spotted watercress in a shallow pool, wild onion growing on a sunny bank, the tracks of rabbit, quail, mule deer. Shelter, the dugout needed work, but its bones were sound. Fuel, dead juniper, cottonwood, driftwood, stacked by previous floods. Stone everywhere, in every size, shape, density. She was building a mental map of the canyon, translating its raw materials into possibilities. She found the wagon at mid-morning, 3/4 of a mile downstream from the dugout, wedged sideways in a deep sandy washout where a side drainage met the main channel. It had been there long enough for sand to bury its wheels to the hubs, for the paint on its sideboards to bleach to a pale ghost of its original blue, for pack rats to build a nest in what remained of the driver's box. The canvas bonnet was gone, reduced to a few tattered strips that snapped in the wind. The back axle was broken, snapped clean where it met the hub on the left side. The tongue was splintered, pointing at the sky at an accusatory angle. To anyone else, to the riders who occasionally traveled the rim trail above, glancing down at the wreckage with the indifference of people who have seen 100 abandoned wagons, it was junk. A relic. A reminder that the canyons took what they wanted from those foolish enough to challenge them. Ilara saw something else. She ran her hand along the iron tire of the rear wheel, feeling the surface. Rust, yes, a rough orange crust that flaked beneath her fingernail, but shallow. The metal beneath was still sound, still dense, still carrying the memory of the forge that had shaped it. She examined the spokes, hickory, tight-grained, dried hard by years of desert air, but not cracked, not rotten. She rapped her knuckles against the sideboards. Oak, solid, weathered on the surface but structurally intact. The wagon bed, what she could see of it beneath the sand, was made of thick planks, far thicker than standard, bolted to heavy cross members with square-headed bolts that were still seated. Her mind was already working, translating wreckage into material. Iron tires could be cut, heated, reshaped into hinges, brackets, straps, tools. Hickory spokes could become handles, pegs, structural members. Oak sideboards could be planed, joined, made into a door, a table shelving. The bolts alone, dozens of them, heavy forged iron, were worth their weight in finished goods. She saw not a destroyed vehicle, but a dispersed workshop, a kit of raw materials waiting to be reorganized by someone who understood what they were. The problem was extraction. The wagon was mired deep, 1,000 pounds of wood iron sand wedged into a washout whose banks were steep, loose, composed of the same sandy alluvium that had trapped the wagon in the first place. Moving it would require equipment she did not have, strength she could not muster alone, money she had already committed, unless she could replace muscle with mechanics. She spent the rest of the day planning. She walked the washout from every angle, studying the banks, testing the soil with her heel, measuring distances with her stride. She located anchor points, a juniper growing from a crack in the rock wall, its roots driven deep into solid stone, a shelf of sandstone protruding from the bank at the right height to serve as a redirect. She found a deadfall cottonwood, its trunk still solid, its bark stripped by weather, lying in the creek bed downstream. Using the belt axe, she spent hours shaping one end into a crude but functional lever thick enough to bear load long enough to provide advantage. The calculus was simple. Force equals mass times acceleration, but leverage converts small sustained force into large displacement over time. Gideon had taught her this with a 3-foot bar and anvil, a fulcrum made from a piece of railroad tie. "You will never be the strongest person in the room," he had told her. "But strength is the crudest form of power. Patience multiplied by physics will move anything." She needed pulleys. She needed rope. She needed flour, beans, salt, pork, enough food to sustain hard labor for days. The next morning, she walked back to Providence. The town looked different from the outside. Smaller, more precarious. A cluster of wooden buildings clinging to a flat bench of land above the canyon country, surrounded by sage, backed by mountains still capped with spring snow. She had lived here for 14 years. It had never felt like home. Now, walking its main street with the dust of Red Creek Canyon on her boots, it felt like a place she was visiting for the last time. She went to the mercantile, the same mercantile that belonged to Caldwell, that had swallowed Gideon's tools for $20, that served as the commercial arm of the Deacon's quiet empire. She had no choice. It was the only store in town. The clerk behind the counter was Virgil Poole. He stiffened when she walked in, his pale face flushing, his ink-stained fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing for another confrontation. She gave him none. She was calm, direct, businesslike. 2 pulleys, 50 feet of heavy hemp rope. She laid $5 on the counter. He filled the order without meeting her eyes, wrapping the pulleys in brown paper, coiling the rope, pushing them across the counter with the tips of his fingers as if afraid of contact. She bought provisions with the remaining $5. A 20-pound sack of flour, 5 pounds of dried beans, a side of salt pork wrapped in cheesecloth. She loaded everything into her canvas sack, the rope coiled over one shoulder, the pulleys hanging from her belt. The total weight was staggering for a person her size. She carried it without complaint. As she turned to leave, she noticed something. Virgil Poole had opened the shop ledger, the big leather-bound book that recorded every transaction at the mercantile, writing with quick, nervous strokes. He was recording her purchases, not just the amounts, but the items. 2 pulleys, 50 feet of rope. She watched him write, watched the black ink form the words that would sit in that ledger for Caldwell to review whenever he chose. She filed this observation in the same place she kept all dangerous knowledge, the quiet, well-organized archive at the back of her mind. Then she left. The walk back to the canyon took 3 hours under a weight that would have broken most people. She stopped twice, setting down the sack, rolling her shoulders, drinking from a canteen she had filled at the town well. The second time she stopped on the rim of the escarpment where the trail began its descent, she looked back at Providence one last time. From this distance, the town was just a collection of shapes, rooftops, catching the afternoon light, a thread of smoke from the sawmill, the white finger of the church steeple pointing at a sky that did not care. She had spent every dollar she owned, 10 on the salvage rights, 5 on the pulleys rope, 5 on food. She was betting everything, her entire material existence, on a wrecked wagon at the bottom of a canyon. If she was wrong about the iron, wrong about the wood, wrong about her ability to move 1,000 pounds of dead weight with nothing but rope pulleys, the physics Gideon Marsh had taught her, she would have nothing. No money, no shelter beyond a crumbling dugout, no plan beyond starvation. The word for this, she supposed, was faith. Not the faith of Deacon Caldwell's sermons, the faith of abstraction, authority, obedience. Something rougher, more practical. Faith in the tensile strength of hemp, in the mechanical advantage of a block tackle, in the stubbornness of her own two hands. She descended into the canyon. That evening, she laid out her equipment on the flat ground near the dugout, organizing it with the same methodical care Gideon had applied to his tools. Pulleys here, rope here, lever here. She reviewed her plan, walking through each step in her mind, anticipating failure points, calculating loads. The cottonwood lever would need to be driven into the ground at an angle, its base braced with stones, its upper end serving as a capstan around which the rope could be wound. The pulleys would create a 2-to-1 mechanical advantage, meaning every pound of force she applied would translate to 2 pounds of pull on the wagon. The juniper tree would serve as the primary anchor, its roots deep enough in the rock to hold against the lateral load. She checked the rope for fraying. She tested each pulley, spinning the sheave, listening for the smooth whir that meant the bearing was clean. She ate sparingly fried dough beans, coffee, conserving provisions. She sharpened the belt axe on a flat stone, honing the edge until it would shave hair. The stars came out. The canyon fell silent except for the creek. The wind, the distant cry of a coyote calling to its pack across the mesa. Alara sat in the doorway of the dugout, the hammer in her lap. Tomorrow she would begin. Tomorrow the canyon would learn what she was made of. She would learn what the canyon demanded. She was ready. Dawn came cold, clear, absolute. She was at the washout before the sun reached the canyon floor, working in the blue half-light, her breath visible, her movements precise. She rigged the block tackle first, threading the rope through both pulleys, anchoring the upper block to the juniper tree with a loop knot that Gideon had taught her, a knot that tightened under load rather than slipping. She attached the lower block to the wagon's front axle, wrapping the hook around the iron reach that connected front to rear running gear. She drove the cottonwood lever into the ground at a 45-degree angle, braced its base with a cairn of heavy stones, began winding the rope around its upper end. The first pull moved the wagon 2 inches. 2 inches of shrieking metal, groaning wood sand cascading from the wheel wells. She reset the rope wound, it again pulled. 3 inches. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, sharp, violent, the sound of something being torn from the grip of the earth. She worked through the morning, establishing a rhythm. Dig sand from around the wheels. Wind the rope. Pull. Brace. Reset. Wind. Pull. The wagon moved in increments measured in fingers, then hands, then feet. By noon it had cleared the deepest part of the washout, its front wheels emerging from the sand like the prow of a ship surfacing from mud. The voices started around midday. Riders on the rim trail, 200 feet above, drawn by the sound of her labor. She heard the creak of saddle leather, the murmur of voices, then a shout that fell into the canyon like a stone dropped from a height. "That wagon's been there since last winter, girl." The words bounced off the rock walls, multiplying, overlapping a chorus of male amusement. "What exactly do you plan to do with it?" She did not look up. She did not pause. She wound the rope, set her feet pulled. The wagon lurched forward 6 inches, its remaining spokes chattering against the sand. More riders gathered through the afternoon. Word had spread, apparently the orphan girl from the smithy was down in the canyon trying to single-handedly haul a wrecked freight wagon out of a washout. It was entertainment, the kind of spectacle that a small town in the middle of nowhere seizes upon with the enthusiasm of the desperately bored. She heard laughter, commentary, the occasional shouted suggestion that ranged from unhelpful to obscene. She heard none of it. Her world had contracted to the rope in her hands, the resistance in her shoulders, the sound of the wagon yielding to physics. Inch by inch, foot by foot. The sandy bank was the worst, loose, collapsing under the wagon's weight, requiring her to dig channels. For the wheels lay flat stones as temporary tracks built up the path behind her so the wagon could not slide back. Her hands blistered, broke, bled, dried, blistered again. The salt of her sweat entered the raw flesh, a sharp, intimate pain that she cataloged, accepted, dismissed. Her muscles burned with a deep structural fire that went beyond fatigue into a territory she had not previously known existed. A place where the body's protests become background noise, where movement continues not through strength, but through the absolute refusal to stop. By the evening of this first day, the wagon was halfway up the bank. She staked the rope, collapsed beside the creek, drank until her stomach cramped, chewed a piece of salt pork without tasting it. She slept where she fell on the bare ground beside the water, the sound of the creek filling her dreams with images of flowing metal, of rivers of molten iron pouring from a crucible held by hands she recognized as Gideon's. The second day was worse. The angle of the bank steepened near the top, the soil transitioning from loose sand to hard-packed clay embedded with stones. The wagon resisted with a stubbornness that felt personal, malevolent, as if the canyon had decided to keep what it had claimed. One of the remaining rear spokes snapped with a sound like a gunshot, the crack echoing up the walls. She heard a groan from the rim. The watchers were back, fewer today, quieter. The comedy was fading. What remained was something harder to categorize. She re-rigged the capstan. She replaced a frayed section of rope. She dug, pulled, braced, reset, dug, pulled. The sun crossed the sky above her, its heat pressing down on the canyon floor like a physical weight. She drank from the creek every hour, ate nothing, saving her energy for the rope. Late afternoon, the wagon was 3 feet from the lip. She could see flat ground beyond the level shelf of packed earth where her camp stood, where the dugout waited, where this whole desperate enterprise would either succeed or die. She wound the rope one final time, wrapping it around the capstan until her arms shook, until the hemp fibers creaked with strain, until the juniper tree swayed visibly under the load. She pulled. The wagon screamed, metal on rock, wood on clay, a sound that filled the canyon like a living thing. The front wheels crested the lip. The body followed, tilting, dragging, shedding sand in sheets. The rear axle caught on a stone, held for one agonizing moment, then broke free with a lurch that snapped the rope taut enough to hum. The wagon settled onto flat ground. It sat there, broken, filthy, magnificent, listing to one side on its snapped axle, its oak sideboards glowing in the late afternoon light. Ilara stood behind it, breathing in ragged gasps, her hands raw, her shirt soaked through dust, coating every inch of exposed skin. She put her hands on her hips. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the rim above. Silence. The watchers had gone quiet. No laughter, no commentary. Just the wind, the creek, the fading echo of a woman's labor settling into the stone walls of Red Creek Canyon. She permitted herself a single nod. Then she turned, walked to the creek, knelt, plunged her ruined hands into the cold water, watched the blood dirt, sweat dissolve into the current, carried away downstream toward a world she no longer belonged to. The wagon was hers. Tomorrow she would take it apart. Tomorrow she would begin to learn what it was hiding. But tonight she ate. She slept. She dreamed of nothing. The disassembly began at first light. Ilara approached the wagon the way Gideon had taught her to approach any piece of work, with patience, with observation, with the understanding that haste destroys more than it builds. She circled the wreck twice, studying its construction, noting the joinery, the hardware, the sequence in which the parts had been assembled, because taking something apart properly means reversing the order in which it was put together. She started with the sideboards. These were the easiest to access, the most immediately useful, thick oak planks, weathered silver on the outside, but still showing the warm brown of sound heartwood where she pried them free. She used the small pry bar from Gideon's things, working each board loose with controlled leverage, careful not to split the grain. The boards came away with reluctant groans, the square-headed bolts pulling free from the cross members with a squeal of corroded iron that scattered a pair of canyon wrens from their nest in the driver's box. She stacked the sideboards near the dugout, sorting them by length, thickness, condition. The best pieces, straight grain, minimal checking, she set aside for the door. The second best would become flooring. Everything else had a purpose. She could already see shelving table planks, framing members for reinforcing the dugout's crumbling walls. The iron she collected with a blacksmith's reverence. Every bolt, every bracket, every brace, every strap went into a pile near the hearth. These were raw material, each piece containing enough good iron to be heated, drawn out, reshaped into something useful. Hinges from bolts, hooks from straps, hasps from brackets. She ran her fingers over a long iron brace from the wagon's undercarriage, feeling the texture of the metal, assessing its carbon content by the color of its rust. The way it rang when she tapped it with her fingernail. Wrought iron, low carbon, tough, rather than hard, ideal for hardware, for things that needed to bend without breaking. She worked through the morning methodical, unhurried, stripping the wagon layer by layer. The running gear yielded axle straps, clevises a kingpin. The tongue, despite its splintered condition, provided several feet of good ashwood. The wheel hubs contained iron bands that could be cut into smaller pieces, each one a potential tool blank. By mid-afternoon, she had reduced the upper structure to its skeleton, the bare frame of the wagon bed sitting on its running gear like the rib cage of some large patient animal. She turned her attention to the bed itself, intending to remove the thick oak planks that formed the floor. These were the heaviest pieces, nearly 3 inches thick, bolted to the cross members with hardware that was heavier than anything else on the wagon. She positioned the pry bar under the first plank at the rear of the bed, applied pressure. The plank resisted. She repositioned, tried again. It moved slightly, revealing the bolt heads beneath oversized square driven deep into the wood. She worked the first plank free, sliding it sideways off the cross members. Beneath it, the expected structure. The top surface of the cross member, the gap between it, the next member, dusty, sandy, unremarkable. She moved to the second plank. Same resistance, same oversized bolts. She pried it free, set it aside. Then the third. The fourth plank was different. She felt the difference before she saw it. The pry bar sliding under the edge met resistance at a point where there should have been empty space. She tapped the surface with the flat of her hammer, listening the way Gideon had taught her to listen, not for what the metal says, but for what the wood hides. The sound near the rear was solid, the dense thunk of thick oak resting on a cross member. But near the front of the bed, the pitch changed. Higher, lighter, hollow. She knelt on the remaining planks, pressing her palm flat against the wood, feeling for vibration. She tapped again, moving forward inch by inch, mapping the hollow space beneath by sound alone. It extended roughly 4 feet from front to back, 3 feet side to side. A compartment. Not a gap, not a flaw in construction, but a deliberate enclosed space built into the floor of the wagon with a precision that spoke of planning, of secrecy, of intent. The joinery confirmed it. She examined the seams between the planks, with her fingers running the tips along the hairline gaps. Standard wagon floors were rough work planks, butted together, nailed down, functional rather than elegant. These seams were tight, uniform, fitted with the patience of a cabinet maker rather than the efficiency of a Wainwright. Someone had taken extraordinary care to make this floor look ordinary while concealing something beneath it. Gideon's voice surfaced in her memory, clear as the day he had spoken, "Everything has a second bottom." Her fingers found a small indentation in the seam between 2 planks, almost invisible beneath the accumulated grime, positioned where a casual hand would never reach. She pressed. Something clicked beneath the wood, a mechanism releasing a latch, surrendering its hold. A section of the floor, roughly 4 feet square, lifted slightly, its edges separating from the surrounding planks, with the soft sigh of a seal being broken. Her pulse climbed into her throat. She gripped the edge of the panel, lifted it away. It was heavy 3-inch oak, lined on the underside, with dark felt, requiring both hands, both arms, the effort of raising it, pulling muscles in her back that were already screaming from 2 days of hauling rope. Beneath lay a compartment lined with more dark felt, its contents arranged with the careful precision of a traveler who understood that fragile things must be secured against the violence of rough roads. 5 long bundles wrapped in oilcloth, tied with leather thongs, laid side by side like sleepers in a narrow bed. A heavy, iron-banded box, small but dense, bearing a stenciled mark she recognized even before her eyes fully registered the words Wells Fargo and Company. Beside the box, protected in a worn leather satchel whose buckle was green with verdigris, rested a thin book. The canyon was silent. The creek murmured. A hawk circled somewhere above the rim, its shadow crossing the wagon bed, crossing Alara's hands, moving on. She reached for the nearest oilcloth bundle. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, not from fear, but from the particular electricity of discovery, the body's recognition that the world has just shifted beneath your feet. She untied the leather thong, unrolled the stiff, waxy fabric. The rifle lay on a bed of raw wool, cradled in its wrappings, with the tenderness reserved for newborn things, sacred objects. Its stock was deep walnut, the grains swirling in patterns that caught the light like water flowing over stone. The barrel was octagonal, its blued finish, a liquid black so deep it seemed to absorb the afternoon sun rather than reflect it. The lock plate bore engraving delicate scrollwork vines, leaves executed with hundreds of hours of patient, skilled labor. The hammer was shaped with the same obsessive precision, its lines elegant, functional, beautiful. Elara knew enough from her years with Gideon to recognize mastery when she held it. This was not a factory product, not a standard-issue military weapon, not something pulled from a catalog. This was a single craftsman's individual vision realized in steel walnut brass, a piece of functional art worth more than most families in Providence earned in a year. She unwrapped the remaining 4 bundles. Each held a rifle of comparable quality, each unique in its details, a different pattern of engraving, a slightly different stock shape, a variation in barrel length, but all clearly the work of the same hand. The same uncompromising standard, the same signature of mastery embedded in every surface, every joint, every line. 5 rifles, 5 masterpieces. Sitting in a hidden compartment in a wagon everyone in Providence had written off as junk. She turned to the express box. It was locked with a simple mechanism, a single tumbler, the keyhole crusted with corrosion. She selected the tip of her hand file, paired it with a short length of iron wire she had salvaged from the wagon's bonnet frame. She worked the lock by feel the way Gideon had taught her to feel the interior of a mechanism through the tools in her hands, pressure here, resistance there. The tumbler's reluctance followed by its sudden surrender. 3 clicks, each one distinct, each one falling into place like the syllables of a word she had been trying to pronounce. The lid opened. Gold. Double eagles minted in San Francisco, their faces gleaming with the particular warm luster that only gold possesses, the color of captured sunlight, of condensed time, of human desire pressed into metal. The box was full coins stacked in neat columns, each column wrapped in paper bands that bore the mark of the San Francisco Mint. She did not count them. She did not need to. The weight of the box told her everything. This was more money than she had ever seen, more than most of Providence would see collectively in a decade. The leather satchel yielded its contents with less drama but more consequence. Inside, a shipping manifest printed on heavy stock, filled out in a neat, steady hand. A driver's logbook, its pages ruled its entries, dated its handwriting, the careful script of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. She sat on the ground, leaning against the stripped frame of the wagon, the manifest in one hand, the logbook in the other, reading in the slanting afternoon light. The manifest was explicit. 5 custom sporting rifles commissioned by the United States Department of the Interior, built by one Elias Caldwell, master gunsmith, Salt Lake City, Utah Territory. 1 Wells Fargo Express box containing $5,000 in gold coin payment for said rifles. Destination, the United States Army Garrison at Fort Cameron. Consignee, the man designated to receive the shipment, arrange its final transport to the fort, was listed as Deacon Josiah Caldwell. Providence, Utah Territory, his brother. The driver's name appeared at the top of the logbook, Harlan Briggs. His entries were professional, sparse recording distances, covered weather conditions, road quality, the health of his team. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the letters formed with the same steady pressure, the same slight rightward lean, page after page, mile after mile. The last entry was dated 14 months earlier. The ink was slightly darker than the preceding pages, as if pressed with more force, more urgency. Entering Red Creek Canyon, Deacon Caldwell to meet me at the south end. There were no more entries. The remaining pages were blank white, untouched, a silence more eloquent than any words they might have contained. Harlan Briggs had driven into this canyon, expecting to meet Josiah Caldwell. He had never driven out. The cold that settled in Elara's stomach had nothing to do with the evening air. She remembered the whispers from a year ago, fragmented gossip that had filtered through Providence like smoke, never quite solidifying into fact. A government shipment gone missing somewhere in the canyon country. A driver who had vanished. Bandits blamed. A search party organized by Deacon Caldwell himself, leading men through the canyons with the grim efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they will not find. The performance had been convincing. Caldwell had mourned the loss publicly, decried the lawlessness of the territory, petitioned the territorial governor for additional law enforcement funds. He had written letters to the Department of the Interior expressing his regret, his outrage, his determination to see justice done. The evidence in Elara's hands told a different story. Caldwell had not been the victim. He had been the architect. He had met Harlan Briggs at the south end of Red Creek Canyon. Killed him, she did not know, how did not want to imagine it. But the empty pages of the logbook were their own testimony. Shoved the wagon into the washout, left it to be buried by sand weather time. Then he had walked back to Providence, organized his search party, played the grieving consignee. Collected insurance money absorbed the loss of the rifles with a public shrug, while privately knowing they were hidden a few miles from his own doorstep. But then the spring floods came. Snow melt from the mountains sent a wall of water through Red Creek Canyon, scouring the washouts, rearranging the geography of the creek bed with the casual violence of a hand sweeping pieces from a chessboard. The wagon lodged in its original position was torn free, dragged downstream, deposited in a new washout hundreds of yards from where Caldwell had left it. When he sent men to retrieve the cargo, she was certain now that he must have tried. They searched the wrong location. The canyon had moved the evidence, hidden it in plain sight, kept it buried under sand, until a 19-year-old girl with a pry bar, a hammer, an old man's dying riddle came along. Everything has a second bottom. Alara sat with the manifest pressed against her chest, feeling its stiff edges through the fabric of her shirt, listening to her own breathing. The light was failing. The canyon walls had turned from crimson to the deep bruised purple that preceded full dark. She needed to think. She needed to plan. She needed to be very, very careful. Her first instinct was to walk straight to Providence, find the nearest representative of the law, lay the evidence on a table. But Providence had no law independent of Caldwell. The town constable was his appointment. The justice of the peace owed his position to Caldwell's endorsement. The territorial marshal visited once a month, sometimes less. There was no telegraph office. The nearest wire was in Nephi, 40 miles north. Her second instinct, stronger, more dangerous, rooted in the same impulsive fury that had made her tear Caldwell's debt paper in half, was to keep the evidence. Build her position. Become someone Caldwell could not simply erase with a ledger entry. Then confront him from a place of strength rather than weakness. Force him to face her, not as an orphan to be evicted, but as an equal holding the instruments of his destruction. This was the instinct she followed. She recognized, even as she chose it, that it was partly strategic, partly personal. She wanted Caldwell to see her standing when the blow fell. She wanted him to know it was her hand that delivered it. It was not wisdom. It was pride, the particular corrosive pride of someone who has been treated as nothing for so long that the first taste of power becomes impossible to relinquish. She wrapped the rifles. She placed them back in the compartment, sealed the false bottom, covered it with loose planks. She carried the express box to the dugout, buried it beneath the woodpile in the deepest corner, stacking juniper logs over it until it was invisible. The manifest, the logbook, these she wrapped in oilcloth, tucked inside her shirt, where they would remain a constant pressure against her skin, a secret heartbeat beneath her own. Over the following days, she transformed the dugout. The work was driven by a new urgency. She was no longer simply building shelter. She was fortifying a position. The knowledge in her possession made every shadow a potential threat, every sound from the rim trail a possible approach. She fashioned a door from the thickest oak planks, 3 boards joined with cross pieces, hung on hinges she forged from wagon tire iron. The forging was crude. Her hearth fire could not match the heat of a proper forge. Her flat stone could not substitute for a real anvil, but the hinges held, the pins were true. The door swung smoothly into a frame built from the wagon's sideboards. She fitted a bar on the inside, a thick oak beam that dropped into iron brackets, converting the entrance from a doorway into a barricade. The floor came next. She laid planks across the dirt, raising them on joists cut from hickory spokes, creating an air gap that would keep the dampness of the earth from seeping into her bedding, her provisions, her bones. She built a cot from oak cross pieces lashed with rawhide, a table from a single wide plank set on trestle legs, shelves along the back wall pegged into the packed earth holding her provisions in orderly rows. The rhythmic clang of her hammer on iron, even the thin, inadequate sound of metal shaped on stone rather than proper steel, became the heartbeat of the canyon. It echoed off the walls, carrying up to the rim trail, where passing riders could hear it, a signal of occupation, of industry, of someone making a claim on this place. Through the oldest currency there is labor. The community arrived in fragments the way water finds cracks in stone, not with declarations of friendship, not with formal welcome, with acts so small they might have been accidental if they were not so precisely aimed. Jonas Falk was the first. He was a freighter, a man who ran cargo between Providence, Nephi, the mining camps to the south. His face was a topographical map of decades in the desert, deep creases running from the corners of his eyes, skin the color of old saddle leather. He did not speak much. Speech in his experience was a form of expenditure, each word a coin spent that could not be recovered. He had watched Alara haul the wagon from the rim trail. He had not laughed. He had, in fact, stayed longer than the others, watching not with amusement, but with the quiet measuring attention of a man who recognizes competence because his own livelihood depends on it. A freighter who understood ropes, pulleys, the physics of moving heavy loads across uncooperative terrain. He saw not a spectacle, but a colleague. One afternoon, his team stopped on the trail above her camp. She heard the jingle of harness, the heavy breath of draft horses, the creak of a loaded wagon settling on its brakes. Then silence. Then the thump of something heavy hitting the ground at the base of the trail. A barrel rolled to the edge, lowered on a rope. Fresh water, 40 gallons, the stave still damp from the spring where it had been filled that morning. He was gone before she could climb the trail to thank him. The barrel sat there sweating in the afternoon heat, asking nothing, explaining nothing. She carried water from it for a week. Nell Hartley came next. She was a widow who lived at the ragged edge of Providence, occupying a small stone house with a failing garden, 3 laying hens, a reputation for keeping to herself. She was perhaps 50, thin in the way of women who have worked harder than they have eaten, with gray hair pulled back under a calico bonnet, hands that were red rough, competent. She made her way down the canyon trail on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a pot of rabbit stew wrapped in a flour sack towel, the steam rising from beneath the cloth like a small domestic ghost. She looked at the dugout, at the door, at the neat stack of firewood, the organized work site, the evidence of systematic, intelligent labor. She nodded the way one craftsperson nods at another's work, acknowledging competence, not offering praise. A body needs a decent meal when they're working this hard. The pot was warm in Alara's hands. The stew was thick with wild onion sage chunks of meat that fell apart at the touch of a spoon. It was the first meal anyone had cooked for her since Gideon died. She repaid the kindness the next day, walking into town with a piece of wagon iron she had heated drawn bent into a new latch for the broken gate of Nell's garden. She hung it herself, fitting the hardware with a precision that made the old gate swing true for the first time in years. Nell watched from her doorway, holding a cup of coffee, saying nothing. Something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. The mutual acknowledgement of 2 women who had learned to survive in a world that preferred they didn't. Others followed. A farmer from the valley below Providence appeared at the camp one morning, leading a mule loaded with a broken plowshare. He set it against the dugout wall, left a sack of potatoes beside it, departed without a word. Alara repaired the plowshare, heating the edge in her hearth fire, redrawing the point on her stone anvil. The work, rough but functional, left it in the same spot for collection. A rancher brought broken branding irons. A mother brought a kettle with a cracked handle. Each transaction was conducted in near silence, the terms understood without negotiation. Broken things arrive, fixed things depart. Payment in food, no ledger, no debt, no intermediary. Her name began to carry weight it had never held. In Providence, she had been the orphan, the extra mouth, the girl who lived in the smithy. Here she was, Alara Wren, the smith at Red Creek. The title was not given. It was earned, forged through the accumulation of small competences, the steady proof that she could do what she claimed. But the knowledge hidden in her dugout pressed against every moment of this new life, like a stone in a boot, present, painful, impossible to ignore. She carried the manifest against her skin until the paper softened with her sweat, the ink blurring at the edges. She checked the express box beneath the woodpile twice a day, 3 times. Her fingers brushing the iron bands in the darkness, confirming its presence, the way a person confirms a heartbeat. She slept with one ear tuned to the canyon, to the rim trail, to any sound that deviated from the established vocabulary of windwater wildlife. 3 weeks after the discovery, the first sign of trouble arrived on horseback. She heard them before she saw them. The muffled thud of hooves on the rim trail, moving slowly, stopping near the point where the path descended to the canyon floor. 2 riders. She could distinguish separate gaits, separate weights. They sat above for perhaps 10 minutes, looking down at her camp. She was at the forge, the flat stone, the small hearth shaping a door latch, the hammer ringing in steady rhythm. She did not look up. She let the rhythm continue. Its regularity a performance of normalcy of someone with nothing to hide. They left without descending. She heard the hooves recede eastward toward Providence. That night she lay in the darkness of the dugout, the door barred, the hammer beside her head, listening. Past midnight, the sound came again, hooves closer this time on the canyon floor itself, moving slowly along the creek. A single rider. The horse stopped somewhere near the dismantled wagon. Silence stretched for minutes. Then the horse moved on, retreating upstream, the sound fading until the canyon reclaimed its own silence. In the morning, she found hoof prints in the sand near the wagon. Fresh, deep, a heavy horse carrying a heavy rider. The tracks circled the strip frame twice, paused near the spot where the hidden compartment sat beneath the remaining planks, then continued upstream to the point where a game trail climbed the eastern wall. Whoever it was had come looked left. A fist of ice closed around her chest. She spent the morning checking the compartment. The false bottom was undisturbed, the planks still in position, the oilcloth bundles still wedged tight in their felt-lined cradle. The rider had not found it, but the rider had been looking. She reinforced the dugout. She strung a system of tripwires around the perimeter, thin iron wire salvaged from the wagon's bonnet frame, threaded through tin cans filled with pebbles positioned at ankle height across the three most likely approaches. It was crude effective, the kind of alarm system that a person builds when sleep has become a form of vigilance rather than rest. The second visit came 4 days later in broad daylight. Two men descended the canyon trail on foot, moving with the deliberate casualness of people who want to appear unhurried. She recognized neither of them by name but knew their type: hired muscle from Caldwell's sawmill men, whose loyalty was purchased by the weak, whose skills ran to intimidation rather than craftsmanship. One was tall, rangy, with a jaw like a shovel blade. The other was shorter, broader, carrying weight in his shoulders that spoke of years swinging an axe. She would learn later that Providence called them Poke Loomis. They arrived while she was away. She had walked upstream to check a rabbit snare. Finding the camp empty, the dugout door closed but not barred. They entered. She found the evidence when she returned: muddy boot prints on her clean plank floor. Her provisions disturbed, the woodpile partially disassembled. They had been searching. Her hands shook as she checked the express box. It was still there, still buried deep, the juniper logs she had stacked over it rearranged but not removed. They had dug partway down, lost patience, moved on. The rifles in the wagon's compartment were untouched. The false bottom held its secret. Poke Loomis, whoever had sent them, had found nothing. But they had been inside her home. They had touched her things. They had left their boot prints on the floor she had built with her own hands, in the space she had carved from the canyon's indifference, through weeks of solitary labor. The violation was intimate, physical, a reminder that privacy is a privilege, extended only to those powerful enough to enforce it. She cleaned the floor. She restacked the woodpile. She moved the express box to a new location, a narrow crevice in the rock wall behind the dugout, accessible only by crawling through a gap barely wide enough for her shoulders, invisible from any angle, sealed with a flat stone that looked like part of the natural cliff face. The rifles she left where they were. The false bottom was her best hiding place, designed by someone far more experienced in concealment than Poke or Loomis were in detection. The waiting had become its own form of combat. Each day carried the double weight of ordinary survival, hauling water, tending fire, doing the repair work that sustained her fragile economy, overlaid with the constant calculation of threat. She cataloged Caldwell's possible moves the way she cataloged materials. What he knew, what he suspected, what he might do with each piece of information. He knew she had pulled the wagon from the washout. The whole town knew that. He knew she had bought Pulley's rope. Virgil Poole's ledger entry ensured it. He may have recognized the wagon, may have sent the riders to confirm, but his men had searched the camp, found nothing. If he was rational, if his avarice was tempered by caution, as she believed, he would conclude that the wagon was exactly what it appeared to be: salvage raw material lumber for a destitute girl's shelter. The hidden compartment had held. The secret was safe. For now. The territorial marshal arrived on the first Monday of the month, riding in from the northeast on a buckskin gelding whose coat was the same dusty yellow as the desert it had crossed. Marshal Rourke was a tall man in his late 40s, lean to the point of gauntness, with a drooping mustache that framed a mouth set in a permanent expression of weary assessment. His eyes were gray, deep-set, the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years reading the worst of human behavior written across the landscapes of the American West. He carried a Colt on his hip, a Winchester in a saddle scabbard, the weight of several thousand square miles of jurisdiction, on shoulders that had learned to bear it without complaint. He rode into Providence, conducted his business reviewing the constable's reports, hearing grievances, signing papers, then turned his horse south toward Nephi. His route took him along the canyon rim trail, past the point where the path descended to Alara's camp. She had been waiting for this day, tracking the calendar by notches cut into the doorframe of the dugout. She stood in the middle of the trail, blocking his path. The buckskin gelding stopped tossing its head. Marshal Rourke looked down at the young woman's soot-smudged face, calloused hands. eyes that held his without wavering. His expression was the familiar weariness of a man who expected to be asked for something he could not provide. "What is it, miss?" Her voice carried the same steadiness she had summoned when facing Virgil Poole, when facing the sawmill men, when facing every challenge this territory had thrown at her. "Marshall, I have something you need to see." Something in her gaze, its directness, its refusal to perform deference or distress, made him dismount. He tied the buckskin to a juniper, followed her down the steep path, his boots sending small cascades of gravel ahead of them. He took in the camp with a lawman's eye, the fortified dugout, the organized worksite, the dismantled wagon, the small forge. His expression shifted from weariness to interest. Inside the dugout, she unwrapped one of the rifles. She laid it on the table, the walnut stock catching the light from the doorway, the blued barrel absorbing it. She stepped back. "Let the object speak." Rourke picked it up. His hands moved over the metal with the slow, appreciative touch of a man who understood what he was holding. He turned it, examined the lockplate, the engraving, the fit of stock to metal. "This is Elias Caldwell's work." His voice had dropped. "The gunsmith from Salt Lake City. Nobody else in the territory produces this quality. There are 4 more." She retrieved them, laid them beside the first 5 rifles in a row. Their barrels aligned, their stocks glowing. Then she placed the manifest on the table, the logbook beside it. She opened the logbook to the last entry, the one that ended mid-sentence, mid-journey, mid-life. Rourke read slowly. She watched his face, the furrow deepening between his brows, the slight tightening of his jaw, the moment when comprehension arrived, not as surprise but as confirmation. He remembered the case. Every lawman in the territory remembered it. The missing shipment, the vanished driver, the search that found nothing, the file that stayed open because open files are a marshal's particular form of insomnia. His eyes moved from the papers to Alara. "Where did you find these?" "False bottom." She gestured toward the door, toward the stripped wagon frame visible beyond. The wagon Bishop Caldwell told everyone was robbed by bandits. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of pieces clicking into place of a puzzle that had frustrated a careful man, finally resolving into a picture he wished he could not see. Rourke set the papers down. He looked at the rifles, at the girl who had found them, at the 4 walls of her hand-built shelter. "You've put yourself in considerable danger, Miss Wren." "I know. His men have already searched this camp once. They'll come back." Rourke sat on the bench, the rifle across his knees, the manifest in his hand. He was calculating, she could see it in his eyes, the rapid assessment of evidence, jurisdiction, logistics, risk. Men like Caldwell were not arrested on impulse. They were cornered methodically, their escape routes sealed before the first move was made. He needed confirmation from Fort Cameron that the shipment was still listed as missing. He needed deputies he could trust, men outside Caldwell's influence, outside Providence's gravity. He needed time. "I'll need your testimony, these items as evidence." His voice was flat, official, the voice of a man shifting from assessment to action. "They're safer in your hands than mine." He shook his head. "Not yet. Moving 5 rifles, a box of gold across open country with no escort, that's an invitation. I need to arrange transport. I need men. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks." The number landed on her like a physical weight. 2 weeks of knowing what she knew while Caldwell's suspicions circled her camp like the hawk that rode the thermals above the canyon rim. 2 weeks of sleeping with one eye open, of starting at shadows, of carrying the old Colt revolver she had found wrapped in rags at the bottom of Gideon's tool chest, a gun she had never fired, whose weight in her waistband was a constant reminder of how far she was from safety. She agreed because there was no alternative. Rourke left the way he came, climbing the trail to the rim, mounting the buckskin, riding south. She watched him go, his figure diminishing against the vast, tawny sweep of the desert, until he was just a dark point on the horizon. Then nothing. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of her life. She worked, there was always work, repairs to complete the dugout, to maintain the small economy of barter that kept her fed. But every task was performed with a divided attention that she hated. One part of her mind on the iron beneath her hammer, the other on the rim trail, the creek bed, the approaches to her camp. She moved the express box twice more each time to a more inaccessible location, each time sealing it more carefully, as if the gold inside generated its own gravitational field that pulled danger toward it. She slept in fragments. 2 hours, 3, never more. The Colt lay beside the hammer on the floor next to her cot. the two objects forming a strange still life creation next to destruction, inheritance, next to necessity. She dreamed of hoof prints in sand, of locked boxes, of Gideon's voice, repeating his last words in a loop that grew louder each time as if urgency could resurrect the dead. The canyon itself seemed to contract around her, its walls, which had once felt protective, enclosing sheltering, defining a space that was hers, now felt like the walls of a trap, limiting her sightlines, funneling any approach into channels she could not cover simultaneously. She began taking walks along the rim trail at dawn, before anyone from Providence would be moving, scanning the flat country to the north for dust for riders, for any sign that the machinery of Caldwell's will had been set in motion. On the ninth day, Nell Hartley made her weekly visit. She brought bread, a jar of preserves, the quiet company that had become their shared ritual. They sat outside the dugout in the thin autumn sunshine, eating in the comfortable silence of people who understand that not every space between words needs to be filled. Then Nell mentioned it, casually, the way people mention things they do not realize are grenades. "Deacon Caldwell was asking about you at the mercantile." She tore a piece of bread, chewed it thoughtfully. "Asking what you found in that wagon, whether you'd been selling anything unusual." Alara's hands continued to move, breaking bread, lifting it to her mouth, chewing while inside her chest something froze solid. She kept her voice level, her expression unchanged. "What did people tell him?" "Same thing everybody knows. You've been fixing plowshares, making hinges, working iron." Nell paused, squinting at the canyon wall opposite. He seemed disappointed by the answer. That night after Nell left, Alara sat in the bar dugout with the Colt in her lap, thinking. Caldwell was asking questions. Not sending men this time, asking personally, which meant the matter had risen from the level of routine surveillance to active personal interest. His men's search had found nothing, but the questions proved that absence of evidence had not become evidence of absence in his mind. He suspected. He did not know what he suspected, perhaps the gold, perhaps the rifles. Perhaps simply that this girl who had been so easily ejected from the smithy was proving harder to eliminate than expected. "A guilty man never stops looking over his shoulder," she whispered to the darkness, "even when what he's looking for is looking right back at him." She needed Rourke. She needed him now, not in 5 more days, not in the careful, methodical timeline of territorial law enforcement. But the marshal was somewhere between Nephi Beaver, the mining camps of the Southern Territory, riding his circuit, making his arrangements, gathering his deputies, with the deliberate patience of a man who had learned that rushing arrests gets people killed. She was alone. She was armed with a revolver. She had never fired a hammer designed for shaping metal, the stubborn refusal to run that she recognized as both her greatest strength, her most dangerous weakness. 3 days before Rourke was due to return, the third night of the second week, the tin cans woke her. The sound was small, a metallic rattlestones shifting inside tin wire, pulling taut, but in the absolute silence of a canyon at 2 in the morning it was as loud as a church bell. She was off the cot before consciousness fully arrived, her hand closing around the Colt's grip, her bare feet finding the cold plank floor. Her other hand found the hammer by instinct, by the same body memory that guided it to the anvil face in the forge. She pressed her ear to the door. Footsteps. 2 sets moving with the heavy, deliberate tread of men who are trying to be quiet, but whose boots, whose weight, whose fundamental relationship with subtlety will not permit it. They were approaching from downstream along the creek, the one approach she had considered least likely, the one whose tripwire she had positioned farthest from the dugout. Through a gap between the door planks, she could see them, 2 dark shapes moving against the slightly less dark background of the canyon floor. Polk Loomis. She recognized the tall one's silhouette, the shorter one's rolling gait. They carried something. She could not make it out in the darkness, but the smell reached her before the image resolved. Kerosene. They had not come to search. They had come to burn. She had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached the dugout. The express box was safe, hidden in the rock crevice behind the structure, inaccessible, invisible. The rifles were in the wagon's false bottom 50 yards away. The manifest, the logbook, these were inside the dugout, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into the canvas sack she kept packed at the foot of her cot. She had prepared for this, not consciously, not with a specific plan, but with the instinct of a person who has been evicted before, who keeps a bag packed near the door, because experience has taught her that departure is always sudden. She grabbed the sack, slung it over her shoulder, moved to the narrow ventilation gap she had cut in the back wall of the dugout, a slot barely wider than her hips concealed on the outside by the overhang of the cut bank opening onto the rock face behind the structure. She pushed the sack through, heard it land softly in the dirt outside. She began to squeeze through herself. Then she stopped. The hammer. It was on the floor beside the cot where she had dropped it when she reached for the Colt. Gideon's hammer. The only thing anyone had ever made just for her. She could hear them now, Polk's boots crunching gravel, Loomis's heavy breathing, the slosh of kerosene in a can. 10 seconds, maybe less. She went back. She crossed the dugout in 3 strides, scooped the hammer from the floor, turned. The door splintered inward. Not a kick-a-pry bar wedging into the gap between doorframe, snapping the oak bar she had fitted with such care. Loomis filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the moonlight, the kerosene can in one hand, a lucifer match in the other. Behind him, Polk held a rifle, not one of the hidden masterpieces, but a common Winchester, its barrel pointed at the space where a sleeping woman should have been lying. Elara was not in that space. She was at the back wall, half through the ventilation slot, the hammer in her right hand, the Colt shoved into her waistband. Loomis saw her. His face registered surprise, the dull, slow surprise of a man whose plans have encountered an unforeseen variable. He lunged forward, dropping the kerosene can, reaching for her with hands that could have wrapped around both her wrists at once. She swung the hammer. Not at his head, she was off balance, half wedged in the wall, operating on instinct rather than aim. The hammer connected with his outstretched hand, the sound a wet, dense crack that was different from any sound she had ever produced at the anvil. Loomis howled. He recoiled, clutching his hand to his chest, stumbling backward into Polk, who fired the Winchester into the ceiling of the dugout by reflex, the report deafening in the enclosed space dirt, juniper splinters cascading from the roof. She was through the slot. The night air hit her face, cold, clean, vast after the claustrophobic darkness of the dugout. She grabbed the canvas sack, ran. Behind her, she heard Loomis cursing Polk, shouting the splash of kerosene being thrown, the sharp hiss of a match struck against stone. She did not look back. The dugout, her dugout, the shelter she had clean-floored, furnished, fortified with her own hands, the first space in 19 years that had truly belonged to her, erupted in yellow-orange light. The flames found the kerosene-soaked planks, climbed the walls, reached the juniper log roof. The heat was enormous, immediate, a wall of warmth that pushed against her back as she ran along the creek bed, her bare feet splashing through shallow water. The hammer in one hand, the sack over her shoulder, the Colt bouncing against her hip. She ran upstream away from the fire into the deeper darkness of the canyon. The creek was cold around her ankles, the stones slippery, the footing treacherous. She fell, once caught herself on her hands, felt the sack's contents shift. The manifest, the logbook safe in their oilcloth, wrapping preserved while everything else burned. She kept moving. Behind her, the fire's glow painted the canyon walls in flickering orange, throwing long shadows that lunged, retreated, lunged again. She could hear Polk, Loomis arguing, their voices, distorted by the canyon's acoustics, bouncing off stone, multiplying, unable to tell whether she had run upstream or down. She climbed. A game trail she had discovered during her weeks of exploration ascended the eastern wall in a series of switchbacks, narrow, steep, treacherous in daylight, nearly suicidal in the dark. She climbed it by feel, by memory, her fingers finding handholds in the rock, her feet testing each step before committing her weight. The hammer hung from her belt, banging against her thigh with every step. The Colt pressed into the small of her back. She reached the rim. The night opened around her, vast, star-filled, the flat desert stretching in every direction under a sky so enormous it reduced every human concern to its proper insignificance. Below in the canyon, her home burned. She could see the glow and orange smear at the bottom of a black trench, the smoke rising in a column that the wind sheared, scattered, carried east. Jonas Falk's camp was 2 miles north along the rim trail. She found it by the smell of his horses, the banked glow of his cook fire. He was awake, freighters sleep lightly, a habit born of years watching for thieves weather spooked animals. He heard her coming, step from his bedroll with a shotgun in his hands, saw her standing at the edge of the firelight, barefoot, soot-covered, bleeding from a cut on her forearm. She did not remember receiving the canvas sack clutched to her chest. She did not explain. She handed him the sack. "Keep this. Don't open it. Don't let anyone take it. Marshal Rourke is coming in 3 days. Give it to him." Jonas Falk took the sack. He looked at her face. He asked no questions. He had been watching the glow in the canyon from his camp for the past 20 minutes, drawing his own conclusions. He set the sack inside his freight wagon beneath a heavy tarpaulin beside a crate of mining equipment bound for the camps in the south. Then he brought her water, a blanket, a pair of boots his wife had left behind when she died, too small for him, close enough for Alara. She did not sleep. She sat on a flat rock at the edge of the rim, wrapped in the blanket, the borrowed boots on her feet, watching the fire in the canyon die. The flames consumed the dugout completely. The door she had built, the floor she had laid, the shelves she had pegged into the wall, the cot where she had slept, the hearth where she had cooked, all of it returning to ash, to smoke, to the same elemental nothingness from which she had assembled it. The hammer lay across her knees. She turned it over, feeling the weight that Gideon had calibrated for her palm, the balance that had not changed despite everything, despite the fire, the flight, the violence, the loss of yet another home. Some things burn, she said to no one, to the darkness, to the memory of a man who had understood that the world is built from materials that can be destroyed, but whose properties cannot be unlearned. Skill stays in the hands. Below, the canyon was dark again. The fire had burned itself out, leaving a column of smoke that twisted upward into the stars, a gray signal against the black sky that would be visible for miles when the sun rose. The sun rose. It climbed above the eastern mountains, throwing long shadows across the desert floor, illuminating the flat country in stages of gold-amber russet. Alara stood on the rim, looking south along the trail. Her eyes were swollen from smoke, her feet raw inside the borrowed boots, her body a catalog of exhaustion bruises, the particular bone-deep weariness that follows adrenaline's departure. She saw the dust first, a thin plume rising from the trail 3 miles distant, catching the morning light, moving north at the steady pace of horses being ridden with purpose rather than urgency. 4 riders. As they drew closer, the sun picked out details: the dull gleam of badge metal on the lead rider's chest, the long shape of rifle scabbards on each saddle, the spare mounts trailing behind, the posture of men who had risen before dawn, ridden through the night's last hours, arrived exactly when they said they would. Marshal Rourke. She stood on the rim with the burned-out canyon behind her, the hammer in her hand, her face blackened with soot that the morning wind was already beginning to strip away. She watched the riders approach. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood, visible, upright, alive. Proof that Caldwell's men had failed, that fire consumes wood but not will. That the evidence they had tried to destroy was safe in a freight wagon under the protection of a man who owed no debt to any deacon. The posse reached the rim. Rourke dismounted, looked at her, looked at the smoke still rising from the canyon, looked at the expression on her face. Not triumph, not relief, something harder to name. The look of a person who has survived the worst night of her life, who is standing on the other side of it, who has already begun to plan what comes next. They came 3 days early, she said. Her voice was hoarse, scraped raw by smoke, by the cold night air, by the effort of not screaming when everything she owned went up in flames. Poke, Loomis, kerosene. Rourke's jaw tightened. What had been a case of grand larceny, fraud, suspicion of murder had just become something more immediate: attempted murder of a witness, arson, obstruction. The stakes had risen. The timeline had collapsed. Where's the evidence? She pointed north toward Jonas Falk's camp. Safe. Rourke nodded. He turned to his deputies, 3 men she did not recognize. Hard-faced, quiet, wearing the look of people who have been told exactly what they are riding into. He gave orders. 2 of them rode north to retrieve the sack from Jonas Falk. The 3rd stayed with Alara. Rourke himself descended into the canyon alone to see what remained. Alara stayed on the rim. She sat on the flat rock where she had spent the night, the blanket around her shoulders, watching the morning light fill the desert. She held the hammer in both hands, turning it slowly, studying it, the way she studied iron, for cracks, for flaws, for signs of stress that might indicate failure. There were none. The head was solid, the handle sound, the balance unchanged. 2 pounds of forged steel, seasoned hickory, the work of a dead man's hands, carrying the only message he had ever needed to leave her. Make something. Endure. Begin again. Rourke emerged from the canyon an hour later, his face carrying the particular stillness of a man whose assessment of a situation has worsened with first-hand observation. The dugout was gone, reduced to a rectangle of scorched earth, charred juniper, the twisted remains of iron hardware that Alara had forged from wagon parts. The stone chimney stood alone, blackened, pointing at the sky like a finger raised in accusation. The kerosene smell still hung in the air, acrid, unmistakable. The chemical signature of arson that no amount of desert wind could disperse before a trained nose arrived. He climbed back to the rim, trailing soot on his boots, carrying a piece of charred plank that he held up for his remaining deputy to see. The wood was soaked through on one side, kerosene penetration, deep into the grain, the kind of deliberate saturation that rules out accident, campfire mishap, lightning strike. This was evidence of intent. This was attempted murder dressed up as property destruction. The two deputies he had sent north returned within the hour, Jonas Falk riding with them. The freighter had the canvas sack slung across his saddle horn, its contents intact, manifest logbook, oilcloth wrapping undisturbed. He handed it to Rourke without ceremony, dismounted, walked to where Alara sat on the flat rock. He stood beside her, saying nothing, his presence a statement that required no translation. Rourke spread the documents on a boulder, reviewing them in the morning light with the concentration of a man building a legal case in his mind, testing each piece of evidence for the weight it would bear in a territorial courtroom. The manifest, the logbook, Harlan Briggs's final entry, the connection between Elias Caldwell, the gunsmith, Josiah Caldwell, the deacon, the missing shipment, the dead driver. Now overlaid with fresh charges, arson, attempted murder, witness intimidation. The case had thickened overnight from a cold file into something urgent, immediate, dangerous. He gathered his men, 4 deputies, the 3 he had brought from outside Providence, plus Jonas Falk, whom he deputized on the spot with a clipped recitation of the oath that Falk repeated in his flat, unhurried voice, his hand resting not on a Bible, but on the stock of his shotgun, which struck Alara as more honest. Rourke outlined the plan. They would ride into Providence at dawn the following morning. Not midday when the streets were populated, when a confrontation could draw civilians into its radius. Dawn when the town was quiet, when Caldwell would be in his house, when the element of surprise would compensate for the smallness of their numbers. Alara was told to remain at Jonas Falk's camp. Rourke was explicit she was a witness, not a deputy. Her safety was paramount. Her presence in Providence during the arrest would complicate an already volatile situation. She agreed. She did not argue, did not insist on being present, did not assert a right to witness Caldwell's downfall. She wanted to. The impulse burned in her chest like forge light behind a closed damper, hot contained pressing against its confinement. But she had learned something from the past 2 weeks, from the burned dugout, from the hammer strike, that had saved her life at the cost of a man's hand. She had learned that the difference between courage, recklessness, is not intention, but timing. She slept that night at Falk's camp on a bedroll, the freighter laid out beside his cook fire, the hammer tucked against her ribs. The Colt unfired, still loaded, still representing a capability she had not yet tested, wedged between the blanket fold. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, indifferent rotation. She dreamed of nothing. Her body, having spent its reserves of adrenaline, fear, physical endurance, simply shut down, pulling her into a darkness so complete it was indistinguishable from peace. Rourke's posse departed before first light. She heard them go, the creak of leather, the soft chuff of horses breathing, the muted jingle of spurs wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. She lay still, listening to the sound diminish, feeling the vibration of hooves through the ground beneath her bedroll, until the earth was silent again, holding only the distant pulse of the wind across the mesa. She rose. She built up the cook fire. She made coffee in Jonas Falk's battered tin pot, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail the way Gideon used to make it, grounds boiled directly in the water. No filter, no ceremony. The kind of coffee that exists not for pleasure, but for function. She drank it standing at the rim of the canyon, looking down at the place where her home had been. The scorched rectangle was visible even from this height, a dark scar on the canyon floor. Surrounded by the cottonwoods, the creek, the stripped skeleton of the wagon that had started everything. The morning passed in the particular slow agony of waiting for news that will change everything but cannot be hurried. She occupied her hands sharpening the belt axe, mending a tear in her canvas sack, cleaning the Colt with an oiled rag, performing each task with the mechanical precision of someone whose body is present but whose mind is 7 miles north in a town she can no longer see, watching events unfold through the walls of imagination. Jonas Falk's son arrived at mid-morning. He was a boy of 14, lanky, freckled, riding a mule that was too large for him, with the awkward competence of someone who has grown up in the saddle but has not yet grown into it. He pulled up at the camp, breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the weight of what he carried. His name was Peter. His eyes were wide with the particular excitement of a young person who has been entrusted with adult information for the first time. The story came out in burst fragments, the chronology scrambled by urgency. Rourke had reached Providence at dawn. The posse rode directly to Caldwell's stone house beside the church, dismounted, knocked on the heavy oak door. No answer. They knocked again. Rourke identified himself, stated his authority, demanded entry. The door opened. Not Caldwell, his housekeeper, a gray-haired woman in a nightgown, her face blank with the bewilderment of someone roused from sleep by armed men. She told them the deacon was not home, had not been home since the previous evening. He had left after supper, she said, taking his horse, his saddlebags, his heavy wool coat. He had told her he was riding to Nephi on business. He had not said when he would return. Rourke searched the house anyway. Empty. The bedroom showed signs of hasty departure. A wardrobe standing open drawers pulled out the small safe in the study, unlocked, cleaned of its contents. Wherever Caldwell had gone, he had gone prepared for a long absence. The marshal's face, Peter reported, had gone very still. Not angry, past anger into the territory of professional calculation. He sent 2 deputies north toward Nephi, covering the most obvious escape route. He sent a 3rd east toward the mining camps, in case Caldwell had chosen the less traveled path. He himself remained in Providence, questioning Virgil Poole, the housekeeper, the sawmill foreman. Anyone who might have seen Caldwell leave might know which direction he had ridden. The answer came from an unexpected source. The night hostler at the livery stable, a quiet, half-deaf old man named Greer, who spent most of his life among horses because he had found them more reliable than people reported, that Caldwell had saddled his bay gelding around 9 the previous evening. He had ridden south, not north toward Nephi, not east toward the camps, south toward the canyon country. Alara felt the information settle into her body like cold water poured into a hot vessel. The shock of contact, the hiss of steam, the rapid recalibration of temperature. South. Caldwell had ridden south, toward Red Creek Canyon, the same canyon where he had killed Harlan Briggs 14 months ago. The same canyon where Alara's dugout had burned. The same canyon whose trails he knew, whose washouts he had navigated, whose southern exit led through 50 miles of broken desert to the Nevada border. He was running, not toward civilization, not toward the law's jurisdiction, but into the wild country, the landscape of canyons, mesas, dry washes that had swallowed men before whole men. Healthy men with good horses, supplies, knowledge of the terrain. He was gambling that the land would hide him the way it had hidden his crime, that the vastness of the territory would absorb him the way the sand had absorbed the wagon. But he was running through her canyon, through the place she had lived for weeks, whose trails she had walked, whose walls she had studied, whose geography she carried in her body, the way a musician carries a score. She knew things about Red Creek Canyon that Caldwell did not. The game trail up the eastern wall, the crevices in the rock face, the way sound moved through the narrow passages, amplified, distorted, carrying information across distances that seemed impossible. She was already moving before the conscious decision formed. The belt axe went into her waistband. The Colt went into the canvas sack along with a canteen, a handful of jerky from Falk's Provisions. The hammer, Gideon's hammer, she gripped in her right hand, not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as a compass, a lodestone, the fixed point around which her sense of self had organized during weeks of solitude, danger, transformation. Peter watched her with the wide eyes of a boy who senses that history is about to happen nearby. "My pa said you're supposed to stay here." "Your pa was right." She slung the sack over her shoulder. "Tell Marshal Rourke that Caldwell went into Red Creek Canyon from the south end. Tell him I've gone down from the rim. Tell him to hurry." She descended into the canyon. The trail down from the rim was familiar, each switchback a known quantity, each handhold mapped by weeks of repetition. She moved fast, faster than safety recommended, her borrowed boots slipping on loose shale, her free hand grabbing at juniper roots, rock ledges, anything that would arrest a fall. The canyon opened beneath her in layers of red, ochre, vermilion, the morning light painting the opposite wall in colors so vivid they seemed geological hallucinations. She reached the canyon floor in 15 minutes. The creek was low, autumn thin, running clear over stones that clicked against each other in the current like scattered beads. She paused at the water's edge, orienting herself. The dugout ruins were upstream, a quarter-mile north. The wagon skeleton sat on the flat shelf above the creek, stripped of everything but its iron frame, its remaining wheels, the false bottom that still held its secret cargo. Downstream, the canyon narrowed, deepened, the walls closing in until the passage was barely wide enough for a horse. The floor, a maze of boulders, gravel bars, deadfall timber deposited by past floods. If Caldwell was heading for the southern exit, he would have to pass through that narrows. The alternative, climbing out of the canyon on one of the side trails, required knowledge of routes that only someone who had spent time on the canyon floor would possess. Caldwell had been here before the night he killed Harlan Briggs, but that visit had been brief, purposeful, conducted in darkness. He knew the south entrance, the north entrance, the main channel. He did not know the side trails, the game paths, the hidden crevices. Alara did. She moved upstream first toward the wagon. The impulse was practical. The rifles were still in the false bottom, the express box still hidden in its rock crevice. Evidence that needed to be accounted for, protected, delivered to Rourke when he arrived. But the impulse was also instinctive, territorial. This was her ground. These were her things. She had hauled them from the earth with her own hands, discovered their secrets through her own curiosity, protected them through her own vigilance. She was not going to let Caldwell pass through this canyon, her canyon, without facing the woman whose life he had tried to erase. She heard the horse before she reached the wagon. The sound carried strangely in the canyon, bouncing off the walls, arriving from multiple directions at once, the echo turning a single set of hooves into a ghostly cavalry. She froze, pressing herself against the rock wall, listening the way Gideon had taught her to listen at the forge, past the obvious sound to the information beneath it. One horse, moving slowly, coming from downstream from the south, which meant Caldwell had entered the canyon from its lower mouth, was moving north through the narrows, heading toward the wider section where the wagon sat, where the creek broadened, where the trail to the rim began its ascent. He was coming to her. She climbed. Not up the main trail he would see her there, silhouetted against the sky, but up a short, steep scramble to a ledge 20 feet above the canyon floor, screened by a stand of juniper that clung to a crack in the rock face. From this position, she could see the flat shelf where the wagon skeleton stood, the creek crossing below it, the curve of the canyon wall downstream, where the narrows opened into the wider passage. Anyone riding through would pass directly below her. She waited. The sun climbed higher, shortening the shadows, filling the canyon with dry, brilliant light. The creek murmured. A lizard emerged from a crack in the rock near her hand, regarded her with one ancient eye, disappeared. Her breathing slowed. Her grip on the hammer tightened, relaxed, tightened again. The rhythm unconscious, the hand seeking the reassurance of the familiar object, the way a child seeks the reassurance of a held hand. He appeared around the bend. Deacon Josiah Caldwell rode a bay gelding that was dark with sweat, its flanks heaving, its head low. The horse had been ridden hard through the night, through the broken country south of the canyon, up the creek bed, through the narrows. It moved with the stumbling reluctance of an animal pushed past its limits. Caldwell sat the saddle with the rigid posture of a man holding himself together through will rather than composure. His black wool suit was coated with red dust. His hat was gone, lost somewhere in the night ride, exposing a high forehead above eyes that scanned the canyon walls with the rapid darting attention of prey. He looked diminished. The authority that had seemed so absolute in Providence, the measured voice, the clean hands, the sermons delivered from a pulpit that doubled as a throne, had been stripped away by 12 hours of flight, leaving behind the raw architecture of fear. He was a man running from the consequences of his own design, heading north because south had proven impassable, because the desert he had counted on to hide him had offered only heat thirst, the indifferent hostility of a landscape that does not care about human plans. He reached the flat shelf. The wagon skeleton stood in his path, the stripped iron frame, the remaining wheels, the bare cross members of the bed. He pulled the gelding to a halt, staring at the wreckage. She could see recognition move across his face, the slow, sickening realization of what he was looking at. The wagon he had pushed into the washout 14 months ago. The wagon he had tried to bury, forget, consigned to the canyon's appetite. Here it was, dragged back into the light by a girl he had dismissed as nothing. He dismounted. His legs were unsteady hours in the saddle on rough terrain, the accumulated fatigue of a night spent running from the collapse of a carefully constructed life. He walked toward the wagon, his boots crunching on gravel, his right hand resting on the grip of the revolver holstered at his hip. He had not drawn it. He was not yet at the point of drawing it. He was still operating on the assumption that he was alone, that the canyon was empty, that the girl whose home he had ordered burned was somewhere above on the rim, out of his way, out of his concern. Alara stood up on the ledge. The movement was deliberate, slow, controlled. She rose from behind the juniper screen into the full morning light, the hammer in her right hand, the Colt in her waistband, her silhouette sharp against the red rock wall behind her. She did not speak immediately. She let him see her. Let the fact of her presence register in his body before his mind could construct a response. Caldwell's head snapped up. His hand tightened on the revolver grip. His face went through a rapid sequence: surprise, confusion, recognition. A flash of something that might have been fear before his features rearranged themselves into the mask of authority he had worn for decades. Even now, even here, covered in dust, stripped of his congregation, his ledgers, his clerk, his hired men, he reached for the posture of command the way a drowning man reaches for floating debris. "Miss Wren." His voice was hoarse, cracked by hours of dry air, but it still carried the cadence of a man accustomed to speaking from elevation. "I would advise you to step aside." She did not step aside. She spoke from the ledge, her voice carrying down through the still canyon air with a clarity that surprised her. Not loud, not strained, but present, filling the space between them the way the ring of a hammer fills a forge. "You killed Harlan Briggs. You stole 5 rifles built by your own brother. You took $5,000 in government gold. You fabricated debts to steal a dead man's smithy from the girl he raised. You sent men to burn me alive in my sleep." Each sentence landed in the silence of the canyon like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward, lapping against the rock walls. Caldwell's face did not change, the mask held, but she could see his hand trembling on the revolver grip. Not the tremor of age, the tremor of a man watching the last wall of his constructed reality crack. "You have no authority here." The words came through clenched teeth. "You are nobody. A charity case. An orphan who should have been grateful for the roof over her head instead of the roof you burned." She let the words settle. Both of them. He drew the revolver. The motion was not smooth. His hand shook, the barrel wavered, the weapon pointing at her, then past her, then back, the aim compromised by exhaustion. Fear, the fundamental unfamiliarity of a man who had always delegated violence rather than performing it himself. Caldwell was not a gunman. He was an administrator, a manipulator, a man who moved pieces on a board. The revolver in his hand was an admission that the board no longer existed. A shout came from above. Jonas Falk's voice, raw, enormous, amplified by the canyon walls into something almost geological, exploding from the opposite rim. Falk had not stayed at camp. He had watched Alara descend, read the situation the way he read weather on the freight road, by the signs, by the feel, by the knowledge that a person heading alone into a canyon where a killer is running does not need to be obeyed but to be followed. Grabbed his shotgun, mounted his horse, ridden the rim trail to a point above the wagon. He had done this not because anyone asked, but because 20 years of hauling cargo across dangerous country had taught him that the most important deliveries are the ones nobody assigns. He stood on the western rim, 200 feet above his shotgun, visible against the sky, his voice rolling down the rock face like an avalanche of syllables. "Put it down, Caldwell." The deacon's head jerked upward. His concentration shattered the revolver, swinging toward the new voice, an instinctive redirect, the body's attempt to face the threat it can locate. In that moment of divided attention, Alara threw the hammer. She did not aim for Caldwell. She was a blacksmith, not a marksman. Her accuracy was calibrated for anvil faces, for nail heads, for the precise point on a piece of glowing steel where force must be applied to produce the desired shape. She aimed for the revolver, for the metal, for the thing she understood. The hammer spun once, its head catching the morning light, the hickory handle tracing a blurred arc through the canyon air. It struck the revolver not squarely, not with the clean impact of a well-placed blow, but with enough force, enough proximity, enough of the desperate physics that governs all acts of survival. The gun wrenched sideways out of Caldwell's grip, the barrel bending at the frame where the hammer's edge connected. The whole assembly clattering to the gravel 5 feet from his boots. His hand, the hand that had signed fraudulent ledgers, that had shaken the hands of men he intended to rob, that had perhaps closed around Harlan Briggs's throat. In this very canyon spasmed the fingers spreading wide, the tendons screaming from the impact's shockwave. Caldwell staggered backward. He looked at his empty hand. He looked at the bent revolver on the ground. He looked up at Alara standing on the ledge above him, unarmed. Now the hammer gone, the Colt still in her waistband, untouched, unfired. She had reached for the tool she knew, not the weapon she carried. The choice had not been conscious. It had been instinctive, the body's declaration of identity in a moment when identity is all that remains. She was a blacksmith. She answered with a hammer. "You're just an orphan." The words came out of him like air escaping a punctured bellows, thin hissing, deflating. "You're nothing. You have nothing." She climbed down from the ledge. The descent took 30 seconds. Her hands finding holds in the rock, her boots scraping on sandstone, her body moving with the unhurried precision of someone who has decided that this moment will proceed at her pace, not his. She dropped the last 4 feet to the canyon floor, landed solidly, walked to where the hammer lay in the gravel beside the bent revolver. She picked up the hammer. She left the revolver where it was. She stood before Josiah Caldwell, close enough to see the broken veins in his eyes, the dust caked in the creases of his face, the sweat staining the collar of his black wool suit. She was 19. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall. She weighed perhaps 115 pounds. She held a 2-pound hammer in her right hand, its hickory handle warm from the morning sun. "I am a blacksmith." The words were quiet. They did not echo off the canyon walls. They did not need to. They filled the space between two people standing in a wash of red stone morning light. The weight of everything that had led to this moment. 14 years of silence. 6 years of apprenticeship. 1 winter of loss. 1 spring of rebuilding. 1 night of fire. 1 morning of reckoning. 3 words. A definition. An identity forged not from birth, not from charity, not from the permission of powerful men, but from the accumulated evidence of what her hands could do. Hoofbeats. The sound rolled through the canyon like distant thunder, growing, multiplying the acoustics of the rock walls, turning 4 horses into 40. Rourke's posse appeared around the bend from downstream. The marshal in front, his badge catching the light, his Winchester drawn from the scabbard held across the saddle, with the casual readiness of a man who has done this before. Behind him, 3 deputies spread in a line covering the width of the canyon floor. They had followed the tracks. Caldwell's horse, Alara's boots, the signs written in the sand that told the story of convergence. 2 paths, one from the south, one from the rim, meeting at the stripped skeleton of a freight wagon that had become the physical center of this entire affair. Caldwell did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The canyon walls rose on either side, vertical, impassable. The posse blocked the downstream exit. Jonas Falk held the rim above. The bay gelding stood 20 feet away, its reins trailing its head down, too exhausted to spook. The deacon was boxed in by geography, by law, by the consequences of choices he had made in this same canyon 14 months earlier, believing they would never surface. Rourke dismounted. He approached Caldwell the way a man approaches a fire he intends to put out, calmly, directly, with no wasted motion. He did not draw his sidearm. He did not raise his voice. He simply held out a pair of iron shackles, their chain links glinting in the sun, the metal making a soft musical sound as they swung from his hand. "Deacon Josiah Caldwell, you are under arrest for the murder of Harlan Briggs, grand larceny, mail fraud, arson, attempted murder." The charges fell from Rourke's mouth in a measured cadence, each one a stone placed on a scale. "You will be transported to the territorial court at Beaver for trial." Caldwell's wrist went into the shackles. The click of the mechanism closing was small, precise, final. The sound of a lock engaging a door, shutting a ledger being closed for the last time. He did not resist. The mask had fallen completely now, leaving behind a face that was merely old, merely tired, merely human, stripped of the authority, the piety, the elaborate architecture of control that had defined him for decades. He was just a man in a dusty suit standing in a canyon, wearing irons. Rourke's deputies escorted him upstream toward the trail that led to the rim, to the horses, to the long ride north to Beaver. Alara watched them go. Caldwell did not look back at her. He walked with the mechanical gait of a man whose body is moving, but whose mind has already arrived at the destination, the courtroom, the cell, the reckoning that would strip his name from the buildings, the deeds, the ledgers of Providence, as thoroughly as he had stripped hers. Jonas Falk descended from the rim, his shotgun broken over his arm, his weathered face carrying the faintest suggestion of satisfaction. Not triumph, not celebration, but the quiet approval of a man who has seen a job done properly. He walked to where Alara stood beside the wagon skeleton, looked at the bent revolver still lying in the gravel, looked at the hammer in her hand. "Good throw. I was aiming for the gun." "You hit the gun." "I hit his hand first, then the gun." A silence. The canyon held it, turned it over, let it settle. Falk nodded once, turned, began the long walk back to his camp. He paused after 10 steps, half-turned. "There's coffee left, whenever you're ready." She was not ready yet. She stood beside the wagon, this impossible object, this wreck that had contained a fortune, a crime, a dead man's final testimony, turning the hammer in her hands. The walnut-stocked rifles were still in the false bottom beneath her feet. 5 masterpieces built by one brother, stolen by another. The gold was still in its crevice, sealed behind stone, waiting. Harlan Briggs was still dead, his bones somewhere in this canyon, unmarked, unmourned. His final logbook entry, a sentence that pointed like an arrow at the man who had silenced him. She owed Briggs something. She was not sure what. Not gratitude exactly, he had not chosen to leave her. This legacy had not known she existed, had not imagined that the girl who would find his hidden cargo was at that moment sweeping floors in a smithy 7 miles north, learning to read the language of iron. But his death had given her life direction, evidence, purpose. His careful handwriting in the logbook had convicted his killer as surely as any witness testimony. He had been, in his own unknowing way, her benefactor, a man whose final delivery delayed by 14 months, murder. A flash flood had arrived at its destination through the most improbable courier imaginable. She would remember him. She would make sure others did too. The weeks that followed moved with the deliberate pace of institutional machinery. Polk was arrested the same morning at the saloon in Providence, still nursing a whiskey, still wearing the boots that had left prints on Alara's plank floor. Loomis was found at the sawmill bunkhouse, his right hand swollen to twice its normal size, the bones Alara's hammer had shattered, already setting crooked without a doctor's attention. They offered no resistance. Men whose courage is purchased by the weak tend to spend it quickly when the buyer is in shackles. Caldwell was transported to Beaver, held in the territorial jail, arraigned before a judge whose reputation for impartiality was matched only by his impatience with defendants who invoked divine authority as a legal defense. The evidence was presented: manifest logbook, the testimony of Polk, who broke under questioning within an hour, spilling the details of the arson, the search of Alara's camp, the standing orders from Caldwell to monitor the girl in the canyon, the implied threat that had accompanied every instruction. Loomis, cradling his ruined hand, confirmed everything Polk said, adding the detail that Caldwell had never disclosed the location where they had been told to dump Harlan Briggs's body, a side canyon 3 miles south of the wagon's original resting place. A search party found the remains: a skeleton in a shallow grave, scraps of clothing still clinging to the bones, a pocket watch stopped at 9:47. The approximate time of death frozen in brass hands, pointing at the moment when Harlan Briggs's life had ended, when Josiah Caldwell's carefully constructed existence had begun its long, slow collapse toward the morning in the canyon. The trial lasted 4 days. Alara testified on the second, traveling to Beaver with Jonas Falk as escort. She sat in the witness chair, a straight-backed oak seat in a courtroom that smelled of pine sap tobacco, old paper facing Caldwell across 15 feet of polished floor. He was thinner. The jail had taken weight from him, or perhaps it was the removal of power that had diminished him, the subtraction of the social architecture that had made him seem larger than he was. He watched her testify with an expression she could not read, not hatred, not remorse, something emptier than either. She told the truth. She described the false bottom, the rifles, the gold, the manifest, the logbook. She described the fabricated debts, the seizure of the smithy, the arson. She spoke clearly, without embellishment, without emotion, delivering facts the way she delivered hammer blows, precisely, economically, each one landing where it needed to land. The jury listened. The judge listened. Caldwell's attorney, a man from Salt Lake City, whose fees were being paid by Elias Caldwell, the gunsmith, in a final act of fraternal obligation, objected frequently, achieved nothing. The verdict was guilty on all charges: murder, grand larceny, mail fraud, arson, attempted murder. The sentence was life imprisonment at the Territorial Penitentiary in Salt Lake City. Caldwell received it standing, his shackled hands clasped in front of him, his face carrying the blank, evacuated expression of a man who has watched the last stone of his fortress pulled away. Elias Caldwell, the gunsmith, Josiah's younger brother, the craftsman whose rifles had been the catalyst for the entire affair, was investigated separately. The territorial prosecutor spent 2 weeks in Salt Lake City examining Elias's books, interviewing his apprentices, reviewing his correspondence with the Department of the Interior. What emerged was the portrait of a man who had trusted his brother absolutely, who had built 5 of the finest rifles of his career for a government contract he believed was legitimate, who had entrusted the shipment to Josiah with no knowledge of the planned theft. Elias had written to his brother 3 times after the shipment vanished, each letter more desperate than the last, asking for news, for explanations, for some reassurance that the work of his hands had not simply evaporated into the desert. Josiah had replied once, a single paragraph attributing the loss to bandits, expressing hollow sympathy, advising his brother to file an insurance claim. The prosecutor cleared Elias of criminal liability, but the investigation destroyed what remained of his professional life. His name appeared in territorial newspapers alongside the words murder, theft, conspiracy, not as a perpetrator, but as a relation which in the court of public opinion amounted to the same stain. Clients canceled orders. The Department of the Interior voided his standing contract. He closed the shop on 2nd South Street where he had worked for 20 years, sold his tools, his lathes, his stock of aged walnut, packed what remained into a wagon, moved his family to Colorado. He took his craft with him. Hands cannot be confiscated, but he left behind the reputation, the clientele, the network of trust that a master craftsman builds over a lifetime, all of it dissolved by the acid of his brother's greed. Elara never met him. She sometimes thought about him, another maker whose work had been weaponized by someone who understood its commercial value, but not its deeper worth. She recognized the kinship across the distance, 2 people connected by the thread of objects they had made, objects that had outlasted the intentions of the men who stole them. The territorial court ruled on the disposition of the wagon's contents 6 weeks after the trial. The finding was straightforward, the wagon having been abandoned for over a year, its contents concealed through criminal action, was legally classified as salvage. Elara Wren, having purchased salvage rights, having recovered the wagon through her own labor, was the rightful owner of everything it contained. The 5 rifles were returned to her, logged as evidence, released by court order. The Wells Fargo Express box, $5,000 in San Francisco minted double eagles, was delivered to her by Marshal Rourke himself, who rode down the canyon trail on his buckskin gelding, dismounted, handed her the heavy iron box with both hands, accepted a cup of her scorching coffee in return. $5,000. In 1882 in Utah Territory, this sum represented approximately 20 years of a skilled laborer's wages. Combined with the rifles, each worth several $100s to the right collector, Elara Wren was by any measure wealthy. The word felt foreign when she tested it in her mind, a garment sewn for someone else's body, ill-fitting, uncomfortable, carrying implications she had not yet learned to navigate. She did not spend it recklessly. She did not spend it quickly. She sat with the money for 2 weeks, the express box open on the table of the temporary shelter Jonas Falk had helped her build near the ruins of her dugout, a canvas lean-to, crude but functional, providing enough cover for cooking, sleeping, thinking. She stacked the coins in columns. She counted them. She put them back. She looked at them in different light, morning, noon, evening, as if the changing illumination might reveal something about their nature that she could not perceive by touch alone. What she wanted was clear. It had been clear since the night Caldwell's clerk had stood in the smithy doorway with his fictional ledger. She wanted the forge. Not the money, not the rifles, not the abstract concept of wealth. She wanted the anvil, the tools, the fire, the smell of hot iron, the sound of steel being shaped by intention. She wanted to stand where Gideon had stood, to do the work he had taught her to do, to prove through daily practice that the thing Caldwell had tried to erase, her connection to the forge, to the craft, to the dead man who had seen her, could not be erased because it lived in her hands, not in a deed, not in a ledger, not in any document that a powerful man could fabricate or destroy. She bought the smithy. The transaction was conducted at the Providence Town Hall, a small clapboard building that had previously served as an extension of Caldwell's authority, but was now operating under the temporary oversight of a clerk appointed by the territorial government. The deed was signed, witnessed, recorded. The price was fair, she insisted on it, refusing to accept the discount. The flustered clerk offered, paying the full assessed value of the property, the lot, the building, the remaining equipment. She wanted no favors, no charity, no arrangement that could later be characterized as special treatment, as sympathy, as anything other than a straightforward commercial transaction between a buyer with money, a seller with property. She walked back into the smithy on a Wednesday morning in late October. The door was unlocked. It had been unlocked since the day she left. No one in Providence having found the courage or the inclination to claim the space that Caldwell had seized, that Caldwell's arrest had rendered toxic untouchable, haunted by association. The interior was dark cold, smelling of dust, old iron, the faint ghost of coal smoke that had seeped into the stone walls over decades of continuous use. Cobwebs stretched between the tool racks. A mouse had built a nest in the quenching bucket. Dust covered every surface in a fine uniform gray, the democracy of neglect treating every object with equal indifference. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust. The anvil occupied the center of the room, unchanged, its surface marked by thousands of hammer strikes. Each one a recorded moment of work performed, metal-shaped function served. It had stood here through Gideon's tenure, through her apprenticeship, through the seizure, through the months of emptiness. It had not moved. Anvils do not move. They wait. She spent a month restoring the shop. Not renovating, restoring. There is a difference. Renovation imposes a new vision on an old space. Restoration listens to what the space already is, removes what does not belong, repairs what has been damaged, returns what has been lost. She swept, she scrubbed, she oiled the tool racks, sharpened the edge tools, replaced the leather apron that hung by the door. Gideon's apron too large for her, which she wore anyway, rolling the bottom edge up, cinching the waist ties tight. She cleaned the quenching bucket, filled it with fresh water. She cleared the chimney, repacked the fire pot with fresh coal, adjusted the tuyere. She lit the forge on the first day of November. The coal caught slowly, the fire building from a tentative orange glow to a steady roaring white heat that filled the room with light warmth, the particular crackling energy that transforms a cold workshop into a living thing. She stood before the blaze, feeling the heat on her face, her arms, her hands, the same heat Gideon had stood before, the same heat his teacher had stood before. The same heat that connected every blacksmith in an unbroken chain back to the first person who had looked at a piece of raw metal, a pile of burning charcoal. The space between them decided to introduce one to the other. She picked up the hammer. Her hammer. His hammer. It fit her hand the way it always had, the hickory handle settling into the grooves of her grip, the head's weight distributing through her wrist, her forearm, her shoulder aligning with the architecture of her body in a way that made the boundary between tool person impossible to locate. She placed a piece of bar stock in the coals, watched it heat, watched the color climb from black to red to orange. She drew it out with tongs, set it on the anvil face, raised the hammer. The first strike rang through the shop. Through the open door, out into the street, across the town of Providence, the sound carried clear, sharp, musical, the unmistakable voice of iron being shaped by fire force and tension. People heard it. They stopped what they were doing, turned toward the sound, recognized it. With a start of memory, the forge was working again. The smithy was alive. Through the weeks that followed, the community reorganized itself around the reopened forge, the way iron filings reorganize around a magnet. Providence without Caldwell was not a different town. It was the same town with a weight removed, a constriction released, the social equivalent of a patient breathing freely after the removal of a tumor. People who had kept their heads down for years began to stand straighter. Conversations that had been whispered were now spoken aloud. Grievances that had been suppressed surfaced, were aired, were addressed through the imperfect but functional mechanisms of community self-governance. Alara was at the center of this transformation, not because she sought the position, but because the forge was the center, had always been the center, the place where broken things were brought to be made whole. The work came steadily: plowshares, hinges, barrel hoops, gate hardware, the endless small repairs that sustain an agricultural community. She did the work the way Gideon had done it, honestly, thoroughly, charging fair prices, delivering on time. Her reputation grew not through promotion, but through accumulation, each completed job a brick in a structure that needed no architect. Jonas Falk stopped at the smithy on every freight run, tying his team to the rail outside, ducking through the doorway, accepting a cup of coffee she brewed on the forge's edge. He never mentioned the canyon, the fire the night he had taken her canvas sack without questions, the morning he had stood on the rim with a shotgun, because he understood that some freight is too important to leave unescorted. He did not need to. The shared history sat between them like a third person at the table, present, acknowledged, requiring no narration. Nell Hartley brought bread every Saturday morning. She would set the loaf on the workbench, pour herself coffee from the pot, sit on the stool by the door, watching Alara work. They spoke occasionally about weather crops, the small dramas of a small town, but the substance of their connection was not verbal. It was the proximity of two women who had each built a life from insufficient materials, who recognized in each other the craftsmanship of survival. In December, Alara commissioned a headstone. She rode to Nephi, found a stonecutter, described what she wanted: a simple granite marker. No ornamentation, just a name, a date, an inscription. She paid in gold coin, double eagles from the express box, the metal warm in her palm, carrying the residual heat of the San Francisco Mint, the hidden compartment, the canyon, the long chain of events that connected a dead driver to a living blacksmith through a language of iron, wood, and tension. The stone was delivered by freight wagon in January. Jonas Falk, making a special trip. He helped her set it in the Providence Cemetery, in a plot she had purchased beside the space where Gideon Marsh lay beneath his own plain marker. They dug the hole in frozen ground, their breath crystallizing in the winter air, the work slow, hard, honest. They set the stone-packed earth around its base, stepped back. Harlan Briggs, 1849 to 1881. Driver. His last delivery arrived. 6 words beneath the name, the dates. 6 words that contained a story only a handful of people would ever fully understand: the hidden compartment, the manifest, the log entry that ended mid-journey, the girl who had completed the route. Ilara stood before the stone, the hammer hanging from her belt, the winter sun throwing long shadows across the cemetery. She did not speak. She did not pray. She simply stood, acknowledging a debt that could never be repaid, only recognized. Spring came to Providence the way it comes to all high desert towns. Not gently, not gradually, but in a series of sharp transitions, cold mornings giving way to warm afternoons, snow receding up the mountainsides in a visible daily retreat, the sage flats erupting in pale green that deepened by the week. The creek in Red Creek Canyon ran high with snowmelt, scouring the channel, rearranging the gravel bars, carrying away the ashes of the burned dugout in a final act of geological housekeeping. Ilara worked. Every day, dawn to dusk, the forge burning the hammer, ringing the anvil, absorbing the shocks of 1,000 daily impacts with the stoic patience of an object that has found its purpose. She made hinges, latches, hooks, brackets. She repaired plows, sharpened axes, set tires on wagon wheels. She took on an apprentice, a 12-year-old boy named Samuel, whose father had died in a mining accident, whose mother washed laundry for a living, whose eyes, when he watched the forge, carried the same focused intensity that Gideon had once recognized in a 9-year-old girl standing in a doorway. She taught him to bank coals, to work the bellows, to judge the heat of steel by its color. She taught him the way Gideon had taught her, with patience, with demonstration, with the understanding that craft is not transmitted through words, but through the hands, through the body's slow acquisition of knowledge that the mind can describe but never fully contain. On the workbench in the back of the shop, 2 objects occupied the same space they had occupied since the day she returned. The small hammer, its hickory handle glowing with the patina of years, a tool of creation, a vessel of memory. The physical proof that a quiet man with kind eyes had once looked at a neglected girl, seen something worth cultivating, invested the best of himself in a 2-pound piece of shaped steel. Beside it lay one of the rifles made by Elias Caldwell. She had kept one, selling the other 4 to a collector in Salt Lake City for a sum that funded the apprenticeship. The roof repairs, the new bellows she had ordered from Chicago. The rifle was a tool of destruction, but also a thing of exquisite beauty. The work of another craftsman whose skill had been exploited by the same man who had exploited Gideon's legacy. 2 objects, 2 brothers of the craft. 2 paths that had converged in a wrecked wagon at the bottom of a canyon leading to this room. This woman, this moment. She stood in the wide doorway of the smithy on a morning in late April, the early light slanting across the hard-packed dirt floor, illuminating the anvil, the forge, the racks of tools, the boy at the bellows who was learning, as she had learned, that fire is the most honest teacher. Her hands rested on the worn oak of the doorframe, the same doorframe Gideon had leaned against, the same wood that had absorbed the oils of his skin that now absorbed hers. The 2 impressions, layered, indistinguishable, merged into a single record of occupancy that no ledger could contain, no clerk could falsify, no deacon could seize. The town moved around her in its morning rhythms. A wagon passed the driver, touching his hat. Nell Hartley crossed the street with her Saturday bread. Somewhere a rooster announced the obvious. The mountains to the east held the last of the winter snow, bright against the blue, melting slowly into the streams that fed the creeks, that fed the canyons that had sheltered her when nothing else would. Ilara Wren was 19 years old. She had been homeless. She had owned a hammer $20. She had spent half that money on the salvage rights to a wrecked wagon that everyone else saw as junk. It was the best $10 she had ever spent.